She stepped off that train with nothing but a worn leather satchel and a letter promising her a future. What she got instead was the most public humiliation a woman could endure in 1878 Colorado, abandoned before she'd even unpacked her trunk. Lydia Monroe had crossed an entire continent for a man who decided she wasn't worth the trouble. But what that coward didn't know, what nobody in that dusty frontier town could have predicted, was that the wrong man's rejection would lead her straight into the arms of the right one. This is the story of how a mail-order bride became a queen of the West. Drop a comment with your city below so I can see how far this story travels, and stay until the end, because what happens next will restore your faith in second chances. The train's whistle cut through the thin Colorado air like a knife through silk, and Lydia Monroe felt her stomach clench with a mixture of excitement and terror that had become painfully familiar over the past 6 days of travel. She pressed her gloved hand against the cool window glass, watching as the landscape transformed from the gentle rolling hills she'd glimpsed that morning into something altogether more stark and unforgiving. Mountains rose in the distance like broken teeth against a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at, and the pine trees that dotted the hillsides seemed to lean away from the wind as if they too were strangers here, trying to find their footing in hostile territory. The conductor's voice boomed through the passenger car. Silver Ridge, Colorado, 10-minute stop." Lydia's heart hammered against her corset stays. This was it, the moment that would define the rest of her life. She smoothed down the front of her traveling dress, a deep burgundy wool that had seemed so practical when she'd packed it in Boston but now felt impossibly heavy and formal. Her reflection in the window showed a young woman of 23 with dark auburn hair pulled back in a neat chignon, green eyes that were perhaps a shade too intelligent for her own good, and a complexion that her mother had always called striking, but which Lydia privately considered too pale, too prone to showing every emotion that crossed her mind. "You're really going through with this?" The voice belonged to Mrs. Harriet Chen, an older woman who'd been traveling to visit her daughter in Denver, and who'd adopted Lydia as a sort of temporary charge somewhere around Kansas. "You've never even met the man, dear." "We've corresponded extensively," Lydia replied, hearing the defensive edge in her own voice. She'd had this conversation, or variations of it, approximately 24 times since leaving Massachusetts. "Mr. Porter is a merchant of good standing. He owns a general store. He's looking for an educated woman to help him with the bookkeeping and to provide companionship." The word tasted like ash in her mouth, but what choice did she have? Her father's death 6 months ago had left her and her mother with debts that had consumed everything: the house, the furniture, even her mother's wedding ring. Her position as a teacher at the Pemberton School for Girls had barely covered their room and board at the boarding house, and when her mother had fallen ill with pneumonia that brutal winter, the medical expenses had been the final straw. Companionship. Mrs. Chen's tone was dry as the desert they'd crossed. "Is that what we're calling it now?" Lydia felt heat rise in her cheeks. "It's a practical arrangement. Marriage often is, particularly in circumstances like these. Mr. Porter needs help with his business, and I need stability, security." What she didn't say, what she couldn't bring herself to articulate even to this kind stranger, was that she needed to not be a burden anymore. Her mother had died 2 months ago, despite all of Lydia's desperate efforts, despite the money she'd borrowed from people who could barely afford to lend it, despite the prayers she'd whispered into the dark at 3 a.m. when the fever was at its worst. And when it was over, when she'd buried her mother in a pauper's grave because she couldn't afford anything better, Lydia had looked at the mountain of debt and the pitying faces of the other teachers and the grim reality of a single woman's prospects in Boston society, and she'd made a choice. She'd answered an advertisement in the Matrimonial News. "Respectable merchant in Silver Ridge, Colorado, seeks educated woman of good character for marriage. Preference given to those with skills in arithmetic and letters. Must be of sound health and moral constitution. Transportation costs will be provided upon agreement." The letter that followed had been formal but not unkind. Charles Porter had explained that his wife had died in childbirth 3 years prior, leaving him with a business to run and no time to court properly. He valued education and hard work. He was not given to drink or gambling. He attended church regularly. He promised respect, if not romance. It had seemed like enough. It had seemed like salvation. The train lurched to a stop, and Lydia's fingers tightened around the handle of her carpet bag. Everything she owned in the world was in 2 pieces of luggage, the bag in her hand and a trunk in the cargo hold. A few dresses, 2 pairs of boots, her mother's Bible, a daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day, and the books she hadn't been able to bear parting with. The complete works of Shakespeare, a volume of Wordsworth's poetry, Sense and Sensibility, and her prized possession, a first edition of Jane Eyre that her father had given her on her 16th birthday. "You'll write to me?" Mrs. Chen asked, and Lydia was surprised to see genuine concern in the older woman's dark eyes. "Let me know you're settled and safe?" "I will," Lydia promised, touching the woman's hand briefly. "Thank you for everything." She'd meant it to sound confident, assured, but her voice wavered on the last word, and she saw Mrs. Chen's expression shift into something that looked dangerously like pity. The platform at Silver Ridge was barely more than a wooden deck with a small shelter at one end. Lydia stepped down carefully, her boots finding purchase on the weathered planks, and immediately the wind hit her with enough force to make her gasp. It was nothing like the coastal breezes of Boston. This was wind with purpose, with sharp edges, carrying the scent of pine and dust and something wild she couldn't name. The town itself sprawled along a single main street, with buildings that looked like they'd been thrown up in a hurry and left to weather into submission. A saloon, a hotel that had clearly seen better days, a livery stable, a church with a steeple that leaned slightly to the left, and there, exactly where Charles Porter had said it would be, a general store with a painted sign reading Porter's Dry Goods and Provisions. Lydia's heart rate slowed slightly. It was real. He was real. This was actually happening. She collected her trunk from the cargo car. A young porter with kind eyes helped her wrestle it onto a handcart and began the short walk toward the store. The main street was bustling with afternoon activity. Cowboys and dusty chaps stood in clusters, their conversation stopping as she passed. Women in calico dresses and sunbonnets paused in their shopping to stare. A group of children playing with a hoop went silent, watching this stranger with the fine Eastern clothes and the big trunk who was clearly not just passing through. Lydia kept her chin up and her eyes forward. She'd been stared at before. Being a young woman traveling alone invited speculation and judgment in equal measure. She'd learned to ignore it. The door to Porter's Dry Goods had a bell that chimed cheerfully when she pushed it open, and the scent of the place hit her immediately. Flour and coffee and lamp oil and leather all mingled together in a way that was almost overwhelming after the sharp cleanness of the outdoor air. The store was well-stocked, organized, exactly the kind of respectable establishment she'd imagined from Charles Porter's letters. Behind the counter stood a man she didn't recognize, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver threading through his dark hair and a face that suggested he smiled rarely, but meant it when he did. He looked up from the ledger he'd been studying, and his expression shifted through surprise, confusion, and then something that looked uncomfortably like alarm. "Can I help you, miss?" His voice was deep, with an accent that suggested he'd spent time in more places than just this Colorado frontier town. "I'm looking for Mr. Charles Porter," Lydia said, setting down her carpet bag and trying to project more confidence than she felt. "I'm Lydia Monroe, from Boston. He should be expecting me." The man's face went carefully blank, and Lydia felt the first tendril of real fear curl in her stomach. "I'm Thomas Brennan," he said slowly. "I manage the store for Mr. Porter, and I think you'd better come into the back room, Miss Monroe." "Why?" The word came out sharper than she'd intended. "Where is Mr. Porter?" Brennan hesitated, and in that hesitation, Lydia saw her future crumbling like a sandcastle at high tide. "He's not here," Brennan finally said. "He left town 3 days ago. Went to Denver to visit his sister." "His sister," Lydia repeated the words as if they were in a foreign language. "But he knew I was arriving today. We corresponded extensively about the date. I sent a telegram from Missouri to confirm." "I know, Miss Monroe." Brennan looked genuinely pained now. "He received your telegram, and then Look, this isn't my place to explain, but Charles left me a letter to give you if you showed up." "If you showed up." As if her arrival was something uncertain, something that might not happen despite the fact that she'd crossed an entire continent at his invitation, at his expense, with his promises as her only security. "Give it to me." Her voice sounded strange in her own ears. Flat, hard, nothing like her usual careful politeness. Brennan reached under the counter and produced an envelope. The paper was good quality, the kind sold in the store, and her name was written on the front in the same neat handwriting she'd come to know from months of correspondence. Her hands shook slightly as she broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet inside. "Dear Miss Monroe, I regret that circumstances have changed since our last correspondence. After much prayer and reflection, I have concluded that our arrangement was premature. My late wife's sister has arrived from Ohio with her 2 children, and family obligations must take precedence. She will be managing my household and helping with the store. I have made arrangements for your return passage to Boston. Tickets will be waiting at the train station under your name. The next eastbound train departs in 4 days. I apologize for any inconvenience this may cause. I have included funds sufficient for lodging at the hotel during your wait. Respectfully, Charles Porter." Lydia read the letter twice, then a third time. The words didn't change. She looked up to find Brennan watching her with an expression that mixed sympathy and acute embarrassment. "There's money," Brennan said quietly, sliding an envelope across the counter. "For the hotel and your meals, and the return ticket is arranged like he said." 4 days, Lydia's voice came out as barely a whisper. "He wants me to wait here for 4 days and then go back to Boston. I'm sorry, Miss Monroe, I truly am. Charles is a good man in most ways, but he makes decisions based on what's practical, not necessarily what's right." The rage that flooded through Lydia was so sudden and so complete that for a moment she couldn't breathe around it. She'd traveled for 6 days. She'd used the last of her money she'd borrowed, money she'd have to somehow repay, to purchase the personal items Mr. Porter's ticket hadn't covered. She'd said goodbye to the only life she'd ever known, to the few friends who'd stood by her through her mother's illness, to her mother's grave, which she'd promised herself she'd visit every Sunday, but now never would. She'd done all of that on the promise of this man, this respectable merchant who valued education and hard work, who'd written her careful letters about his store and his town and the life they might build together. And he'd discarded her, not even in person, not even with the basic courtesy of a difficult conversation, but with a letter and some money, as if she were a delivery that hadn't quite worked out. "Miss Monroe?" Brennan's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right? Should I fetch someone? The doctor, perhaps, or—" "No." The word came out too loud, echoing in the quiet store. Lydia took a breath, then another, trying to force down the panic that was rising like bile in her throat. "No, I'm fine. Thank you for the letter. And the money." She picked up both envelopes with hands that had stopped shaking and now felt peculiarly numb. The money envelope felt obscenely heavy. Blood money, she thought wildly. Payment for her humiliation. "The hotel is just down the street," Brennan was saying, his voice gentle in a way that made Lydia want to scream. "Mrs. Kowalski runs it. She's a kind woman. You'll be comfortable there until I slink back east with my tail between my legs," Lydia heard herself say. "Until I return to Boston and explain to everyone who pitied me enough to loan me money that I failed, that I'm even more of a charity case than I was before." Brennan opened his mouth, closed it again. What could he say? There were no words that would make this better. Lydia turned toward the door, then stopped. Through the front window, she could see that a small crowd had gathered outside. Of course they had. A strange woman arriving alone with a trunk was news in a town like this. They'd probably been speculating about her from the moment she stepped off the train, and now they were waiting to see what would happen next, waiting to witness her shame. She couldn't face them. Not yet. Not with this letter burning in her hand and this sick feeling churning in her stomach and tears threatening at the corners of her eyes that she absolutely could not shed in front of strangers. "Is there a back door?" she asked. "Miss Monroe, you don't need to— Is there a back door?" She repeated the question with enough force that Brennan actually flinched. "Yes, through the stockroom." He gestured toward a door behind the counter. "But please, let me help you with your trunk at least. Or I could get someone to— I can manage." She couldn't, actually. The trunk was heavy, and the handcart the porter had lent her was still outside the front entrance. But pride, stupid, pointless pride, made her heft her carpet bag and leave the trunk where it sat. She could come back for it later, after dark perhaps, when fewer people would be watching. The stockroom was exactly what she'd expected: shelves of dry goods, sacks of flour and sugar, crates waiting to be unpacked. The back door opened onto an alley that smelled of old garbage and horse manure, and Lydia stepped out into it like she was escaping a burning building. The sun was lower now, painting the mountains gold and purple, and the wind had picked up to a steady howl. Lydia pressed her back against the rough wooden wall of the building and finally let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. She was stranded. That was the simple truth of it. She had enough money for 4 days at a hotel and a ticket back to a place where she had nothing and no one. She had no family, no home, no prospects. She'd burned every bridge in Boston when she'd made the choice to come west, and even if she went back, what then? Another teaching position if she was lucky, though her abrupt departure would make finding one difficult. More debt, more pitying looks, the slow, grinding poverty of a single woman trying to survive in a world that had no real place for her. Or she could stay here, in this town where everyone now knew she'd been rejected before she'd even had a chance to unpack. Where Charles Porter's late wife's sister was probably already settling into the role that should have been Lydia's, already becoming part of the community, while Lydia remained the outsider who wasn't wanted. Neither option was acceptable. Neither option was survivable. Lydia closed her eyes and tried to remember the last time she'd prayed, really prayed, not just the automatic words she'd whispered over her mother's grave. It had been in church the Sunday before she'd left Boston. She'd sat in the back pew, alone, and asked God for courage, for strength, for the ability to build something new from the ruins of everything she'd lost. Some answer, she muttered to the empty alley. Some divine providence. Talking to yourself is the first sign of trouble, you know. Lydia's eyes flew open. The voice was male, rich, and deep, with a hint of amusement that should have been offensive under the circumstances, but somehow wasn't. She turned to find a man standing at the entrance to the alley, a tall man, broad-shouldered and long-limbed, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were an unusual shade of gray-blue, like storm clouds over water. He was dressed like a rancher, worn denim pants, a work shirt that had seen better days, boots that were scuffed but well-maintained. He had a weathered face that suggested he spent most of his time outdoors, with lines around his eyes that could have been from squinting into the sun or from laughter. It was hard to tell which. He was perhaps in his mid-30s, though the frontier had a way of aging people that made it difficult to judge, and he was looking at her with an expression of such frank curiosity that Lydia felt herself bristle defensively. "Can I help you?" she asked, hearing the frost in her own voice. "That's what I came to ask you, actually." He took a few steps closer, and Lydia noticed he moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. "I'm Rowan Blackwell. I own the Broken Creek Ranch about 6 miles west of town, and I couldn't help but notice that you seem to be in some distress." "I'm fine." "You're standing in an alley behind Porter's store, clutching a carpet bag like your life depends on it, and you look about 2 seconds away from either punching something or bursting into tears." His tone was matter-of-fact, not unkind. "That doesn't strike me as fine." Lydia drew herself up to her full height, which was a respectable 5 feet 6 inches, though it felt insignificant next to this man's considerable frame. "My circumstances are my own business, Mr. Blackwell. I don't recall asking for your input." "No, you didn't," he agreed easily, "but I'm giving it anyway, because I was in the store about 20 minutes ago buying supplies, and I heard what Thomas Brennan said to you, and then I saw you come back here looking like the world had ended, and I figured someone should check on you." Heat flooded Lydia's face. "You were listening?" "The store isn't that big, Miss Monroe, and Brennan wasn't exactly whispering." Rowan's expression sobered. "Look, I know what Charles did, or rather, what he didn't do, and it's cowardly and dishonorable, and you have every right to be angry. I don't need your pity. I'm not offering pity, I'm offering perspective." He leaned against the opposite wall of the alley, settling in as if he had all the time in the world. "Charles Porter is a weak man who makes decisions based on fear and convenience. His wife was a strong woman, too strong for him if you ask me. And when she died, he fell apart. Been falling apart ever since. His late wife's sister is a bossy, managing type who probably railroaded him into changing his mind about you, and he took the path of least resistance like he always does. That doesn't make it acceptable. No, Rowan agreed, it doesn't, but it does make it predictable. And it means you dodged a bullet, Miss Monroe. Life with Charles Porter would have been miserable. You would have done all the work while he took all the credit, and his sister-in-law would have made your life hell because she would have seen you as competition. Lydia wanted to argue, but something in his words rang true. She thought about Charles Porter's letters, careful, formal, always focused on what he needed rather than what he might offer. She thought about the way he'd described his late wife in vague, dutiful terms, but had never once mentioned missing her. She thought about how easily he'd summoned her across a continent and then dismissed her with a letter. That may be true, she said quietly, but it doesn't change my current situation. I have nowhere to go and very limited means. I'll have to return to Boston and try to rebuild a life that was barely sustainable before I left. Or, Rowan said, and there was something in his tone that made Lydia look up sharply, you could stay. Stay? Here? In Silver Ridge? She couldn't keep the bitterness out of her laugh. As what? The woman who was too unacceptable even for Charles Porter? The failed mail-order bride who became the town's object of pity and gossip. As my housekeeper. The words dropped into the space between them like stones into still water. Lydia stared at him, certain she'd misheard. I beg your pardon? Rowan pushed away from the wall, and she noticed for the first time that he had a slight limp, favoring his left leg just a bit. An old injury, maybe, or just the result of years of hard work. I need a housekeeper, he said simply. My ranch is profitable, but I've been living like a bachelor for too long. The house is a disaster. The cooking is barely edible, and I spend more time doing laundry than I do running cattle. I need help, real help. Someone educated who can keep books, manage supplies, run a household properly. You're offering me a job. Lydia spoke slowly, testing the words. Based on a 5-minute conversation in an alley where you watched me have what was essentially a breakdown. I'm offering you an option, Rowan corrected. 3 months trial employment, room and board plus fair wages, say $25 a month. You'd have your own room, your own space. You'd manage the household, keep the books, help with correspondence. At the end of 3 months, if it's working for both of us, we renegotiate. If it's not, you'll have money saved and time to figure out your next move, and you won't have to crawl back east with nothing. It was too good, too convenient, too much like the kind of offer that came with expectations that weren't being stated out loud. And what exactly would you expect in return, Mr. Blackwell? Lydia kept her voice level, but she let steel creep into it. Beyond the housekeeping, I mean. To her surprise, Rowan laughed, a genuine, full-throated sound that transformed his serious face into something surprisingly boyish. I expect you to keep my house clean, my accounts in order, and my meals edible, he said. That's it? I'm not Charles Porter, Miss Monroe. I'm not looking for a wife or anything else. I'm looking for someone competent to help me run my ranch more efficiently. The fact that Charles was too stupid to see your value doesn't mean I am. Lydia studied him carefully, looking for the lie, the hidden agenda. The trap she'd learned the hard way always seemed to be waiting. But Rowan Blackwell's storm-gray eyes were steady and direct, and there was something in his bearing, a kind of straightforward honesty, that made her want to believe him. Why? She finally asked. Why would you help a complete stranger? Because someone should, he said simply. Because what Charles did was wrong, and nobody else in this town has the spine to say so. Because I've been where you are, desperate and alone and trying to figure out how to survive when the world keeps kicking you down. And because, he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, because I think you're exactly the kind of person who'll turn this situation into an opportunity instead of a disaster, and I'd rather have that energy working for me than wasted on Charles Porter's guilty conscience. A gust of wind swirled through the alley, carrying dust and the distant sound of piano music from the saloon. Lydia pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and made a decision that felt simultaneously reckless and inevitable. 3 months, she said. A fair trial for both of us. But I want it in writing, Mr. Blackwell. A proper contract specifying my duties and my compensation, and my own locked room. Done. He held out his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Lydia shook it. His grip was firm, calloused, the hand of a man who worked hard for his living. "Welcome to Broken Creek Ranch, Miss Monroe. I promise you won't regret this." As Lydia retrieved her trunk, Rowan carried it easily despite his limp, loading it into a wagon hitched to two sturdy horses. She caught sight of faces watching from windows along the main street. Let them watch, she thought with a fierce surge of defiance. Let them gossip and speculate and wonder. She'd been discarded and dismissed, yes, but she'd also been offered something she'd never expected, a choice. And this time, she was choosing for herself. The ride to Broken Creek Ranch took them through landscape that grew progressively wilder with each mile they put between themselves and Silver Ridge. Lydia sat beside Rowan on the wagon bench, her trunk secured in the back, and tried to process the cascade of decisions that had led her to this moment. 24 hours ago, she'd been on a train heading toward what she'd believed would be her future. Now she was traveling into the mountains with a man she'd met less than an hour ago, gambling everything on a handshake and a promise that might prove just as empty as Charles Porter's letters. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was weighted with things unsaid. Rowan handled the horses with easy competence, his attention mostly on the road ahead, which had narrowed to little more than a track carved through pine forest. Occasionally he'd point out a landmark, a distinctive rock formation, a creek crossing, the place where he'd once seen a bear with two cubs, and Lydia would nod and file the information away, building a mental map of this strange new territory. "You'll want to remember these markers," Rowan said, as they passed a lightning-struck tree that stood white and skeletal against the darkening sky. "It's easy to get lost out here if you're not paying attention. The mountains all start to look the same after a while." "Do you expect I'll be traveling this road often?" Lydia asked, surprised by the question. "You'll need supplies from town regularly, and you're free to come and go as you please." He glanced at her briefly, those storm-colored eyes unreadable in the fading light. "I meant what I said, Miss Monroe. You're an employee, not a prisoner. If you want to ride into Silver Ridge for church on Sundays, or to post letters, or just to remind yourself that civilization exists, you're welcome to take one of the horses." "I don't know how to ride." The admission came out more defensive than she'd intended, and Lydia felt heat rise in her cheeks. Another skill she didn't possess. Another way she was unprepared for this life she'd stumbled into. But Rowan just nodded thoughtfully. "Then you'll learn. One of my men can teach you. Cal's good with nervous horses and nervous people. He'll have you riding in a week or two." The casual certainty with which he said it, as if learning to ride a horse was no more complicated than learning a new recipe, should have annoyed her. Instead, Lydia felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of anxiety she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. When was the last time someone had simply assumed she was capable of learning something new, rather than treating her limitations as permanent fixtures? They crested a rise, and Rowan pulled the horses to a stop. "There," he said simply, gesturing ahead. Lydia followed his gaze and felt her breath catch. The valley below was painted in the colors of early evening, gold and amber and deep purple shadows. A creek cut through it, catching the last of the sunlight like a ribbon of molten silver. And nestled against the far hillside, surrounded by fenced pastures where cattle grazed in dark clusters, stood a house. It wasn't grand, it wasn't even particularly large, but it was solid. A two-story structure built from logs and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and a stone chimney from which smoke was rising. Outbuildings clustered nearby. A barn, a bunkhouse, what looked like a smokehouse and a chicken coop. Beyond them, corrals and fences stretched out in neat lines, evidence of careful planning and hard work. "Broken Creek Ranch," Rowan said, and there was unmistakable pride in his voice. "Built it myself, mostly. Well, with help from the men. But I designed it, cleared the land, set every fence post. Took me 8 years to get it to where it is now." "It's beautiful," Lydia said, and meant it. There was something about the way the ranch fit into the landscape, as if it had grown there naturally rather than been imposed by human hands, that appealed to her in a way she hadn't expected. "It's home," Rowan agreed. He clicked to the horses and they started down the slope, the wagon wheels finding the ruts worn by countless previous journeys. "Fair warning, though, the inside doesn't match the outside. I'm better at building fences than keeping house." That, Lydia would soon discover, was a considerable understatement. As they pulled up to the main house, Two men emerged from the barn. Both were lean and weathered in the way of men who lived their lives outdoors, but they couldn't have been more different otherwise. The first was perhaps 60, with silver hair and a face mapped with wrinkles, wearing clothes that had been patched so many times they were more patch than original fabric. The second was younger, maybe 30, with dark skin, careful eyes, and the kind of stillness that suggested he didn't miss much. "Evening, boss," the older man said, then stopped short when he caught sight of Lydia. "Well now, wasn't expecting company." "Miss Lydia Monroe, meet Marcus Webb and Calvin Porter," Rowan said, climbing down from the wagon and then turning to offer Lydia his hand. "They keep this place running when I'm too stubborn to ask for help. Gentlemen, Miss Monroe is our new housekeeper. She'll be taking over management of the household starting tomorrow." The two men exchanged a look that Lydia couldn't quite read, but Marcus recovered first, sweeping off his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Ma'am, welcome to Broken Creek. Can't say the house is in any fit state for a lady, but I reckon that's why you're here." Calvin's greeting was quieter, a simple nod of acknowledgement, but his eyes were sharp as he took in Lydia's traveling dress, her carpet bag, the trunk in the back of the wagon. She had the distinct impression she was being assessed, measured against some private standard, and she lifted her chin slightly, meeting his gaze directly. Whatever test this was, she wouldn't fail it by looking away. "Miss Monroe's had a long journey," Rowan was saying. "Cal, can you help me get her trunk inside? Marcus, is there anything edible for supper, or should I ride back to town and beg Mrs. Kowalski for mercy?" "There's stew," Marcus said, sounding defensive. "Made it myself this morning. It's got meat and potatoes and other things." "Other things," Rowan repeated dryly. "That's what worries me. Miss Monroe, I apologize in advance for whatever we're about to subject you to." But as Lydia followed Rowan up the porch steps and through the front door, food was the last thing on her mind. She stopped just inside the threshold and stared, trying to process what she was seeing. The main room was large and well-proportioned, with a massive stone fireplace at one end and windows that must have provided beautiful views of the valley during daylight hours. The bones of it were good. Solid wood floors, exposed beam ceiling, built-in shelves that spoke to thoughtful craftsmanship. But the reality of how the space was currently being used made Lydia's hands itch for a broom, a mop, and possibly a shovel. Dishes were stacked on every available surface, some of them sporting what looked like several days' worth of accumulated grime. Clothes were draped over chairs and hung from pegs on the walls in no particular order. Books and newspapers and what appeared to be ranch ledgers were scattered across a large wooden table, along with tack that was in various states of repair, a half-empty whiskey bottle, and a coffee pot that looked like it had never been properly cleaned. The floor hadn't been swept in what must have been weeks, and there was a suspicious stain near the fireplace that Lydia chose not to examine too closely. "I did warn you," Rowan said from behind her, and she could hear embarrassment threading through his voice. "We're not exactly civilized out here." "You're not exactly anything out here," Lydia said faintly. How do you live like this?" "Badly," he admitted. "We work hard, we come home exhausted, and we eat and sleep, and don't much think about the state of things until it gets bad enough that we can't find clean clothes or the mice start getting bold. It's not ideal." Lydia turned to look at him, and something in her expression must have been fierce because Rowan actually took a step back, hands raised in mock surrender. "I promise you, it's not usually quite this bad," he said. "We've been short-handed the past 2 weeks while we dealt with a fence break-up in the north pasture, and things got away from us. But that's exactly why I need help, real help. Not just someone to cook and clean, but someone to manage things properly so they don't get to this state in the first place." Despite everything, the exhaustion of travel, the emotional whiplash of the day, the surreal nature of finding herself in this bachelor chaos, Lydia felt a smile tugging at her lips. Because this, at least, was a problem she understood. This was a challenge she knew how to meet. "Where's the kitchen?" she asked. Rowan blinked. "You want to see the kitchen? Now? It's even worse than this room." "I sincerely doubt that's possible, but yes. I need to assess the full scope of the disaster before I can plan my strategy." The kitchen was, in fact, worse, but it was also well equipped, with a good cast iron stove, ample counter space, and shelves that, once cleared of their current chaotic contents, would provide excellent storage. Lydia walked through it slowly, opening cupboards, examining supplies, making mental notes about what was present and what was desperately needed. "The water pump is just outside the back door," Rowan said, watching her with an expression that mixed hope and trepidation. "Well's good and deep, never runs dry even in August. And there's a root cellar under the kitchen, access through that trapdoor there, that stays cool year-round." Lydia nodded, still cataloging. Flour, sugar, salt, coffee, dried beans, canned goods in surprising abundance. The basics were all there. It was just that they were buried under layers of disorganization and grime. "I'll need cleaning supplies," she said. "Lye soap, brushes, vinegar, fresh rags. And we'll need to do something about that stove. When was the last time it was properly blacked?" "I genuinely don't remember," Rowan admitted. "Of course you don't." Lydia turned to face him, squaring her shoulders. "Mr. Blackwell, I'll be honest with you. This house is in worse condition than I expected. It's going to take more than a few days to set it right. It's going to take weeks of hard work, and I'll need cooperation from everyone who lives here. I can't maintain order if you and your men are going to immediately undo everything I organize." "You'll have it," Rowan said immediately. "I'll talk to Marcus and Cal tonight. From tomorrow on, they keep their gear in the bunkhouse and their boots at the door, and I'll—" He paused, looking around his own kitchen as if seeing it for the first time. "I'll try to be less of a disaster." "See that you do." Lydia softened her tone slightly. "I appreciate the opportunity you're giving me, Mr. Blackwell. I won't waste it, but I also won't pretend that this is going to be easy or that I can work miracles overnight." "I don't expect miracles," Rowan said. "I just expect competence and honesty, which, based on the last hour, you seem to have in abundance." He showed her to her room then, a small chamber on the second floor with a window overlooking the valley, a narrow bed with a surprisingly good mattress, a washstand, and a wardrobe that smelled of cedar. It was clean, Lydia noticed with relief, and the linens on the bed looked freshly laundered, as if Rowan had at least made an effort to prepare this one space for her arrival. "There's a lock on the door," he said, pointing to the sturdy iron mechanism. "Key's in it. You can bolt it from the inside too if that makes you feel safer. The nearest bedroom is mine at the other end of the hall. Marcus and Cal sleep in the bunkhouse." "Thank you," Lydia said, and meant it. The lock, the distance, the careful attention to her privacy, all of it spoke to a respect for boundaries that she hadn't dared hope for. Rowan lingered in the doorway for a moment, seeming to search for words. "I know this isn't what you came west for," he finally said. "I know it's not the future you imagined, but I hope you'll give it a fair chance." "Give us a fair chance. We're rough around the edges, but we're honest, and I think you'll find that out here. Honest counts for more than polished." After he left, Lydia sat on the edge of the bed and let herself feel the full weight of the day settle over her like a physical thing. She'd been rejected, humiliated, and effectively abandoned in a strange town. She'd made a rash decision to accept employment from a man she barely knew. She'd committed herself to 3 months in a place so remote it made Silver Ridge look cosmopolitan by comparison. But as she looked around the simple room with its cedar wardrobe and its window framing a slice of star-studded sky, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Possibility. The sense that maybe, just maybe, this disaster might turn into something resembling a future. Dinner was indeed Marcus's stew, which turned out to be better than Rowan's warnings had suggested, even if the other things remained mysterious. They ate at the big kitchen table after Lydia had cleared enough space for 4 plates, and the conversation flowed easier than she'd expected. Marcus told stories about the early days of the ranch, when it had been just him and Rowan and a dream of building something that would last. Cal spoke less, but listened more, occasionally adding quiet observations that showed he'd been paying attention all along. And Rowan presided over it all with the easy authority of a man comfortable in his own domain, making sure Lydia had enough to eat, drawing her into the conversation when she seemed inclined to simply observe. "So what brought you west, Miss Monroe?" Marcus asked, sopping up stew with a piece of bread. "If you don't mind my asking, not many Eastern ladies make the trip alone." Lydia considered how much to share, how much of her story these strangers needed to know. But there was something about the way they were all looking at her, with curiosity but not judgment, with interest but not intrusion, that made her want to be honest. "I was supposed to marry Charles Porter," she said quietly. "He advertised for a wife," I answered. "We corresponded for months, and when I arrived today I discovered he'd changed his mind and left town to avoid telling me in person." The silence that followed was heavy with shared outrage. Marcus's weathered face went hard, and Cal's jaw tightened in a way that suggested he was fighting to keep his opinions to himself. "That's spineless to—" Marcus started, then caught himself with a glance at Lydia. "Pardon my language, ma'am, but Charles Porter is a coward and a fool, and I'd like to tell him so to his face." "You'd have to stand in line," Rowan said dryly. "But what's done is done." Charles showed his true colors, and Miss Monroe is better off for knowing them now rather than after a wedding, and we're better off for having her here instead of wasted on managing his store. "Amen to that," Marcus agreed, raising his coffee cup in salute. "Welcome to Broken Creek, Miss Monroe. We may not be civilized, but we're loyal, and we don't go back on our word." Later, after the men had retreated to the bunkhouse and Rowan had disappeared into what he called his office, Lydia stood at her bedroom window and looked out at the darkness. Somewhere out there were mountains and valleys and wild country that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. Somewhere out there was a life she might build from the ruins of the one she'd left behind. She thought about her mother, buried in that pauper's grave in Boston. She thought about the promises she'd made and the dreams she'd abandoned and the desperate hope that had brought her across a continent to a man who'd decided she wasn't worth the trouble. "I'm still here," she whispered to the night, to the ghost of her mother, to whatever version of herself she'd been when she'd stepped off that train. "He didn't want me, but I'm still here, and I'm going to make this work." The mountain wind whistled around the eaves in response, wild and fierce, and absolutely indifferent to her small human determination. But Lydia had learned something important today. Sometimes the wrong door closing was just the universe's way of pointing you toward the right one. She just had to be brave enough to walk through it. The next morning arrived with the kind of golden light that made everything seem possible, and Lydia woke to the sound of roosters crowing and men's voices drifting up from somewhere below. She dressed quickly in her oldest work dress, a practical gray cotton that had seen her through countless days of teaching, and braided her hair in a crown around her head to keep it out of the way. When she looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, she barely recognized the woman looking back. Not the polished teacher from Boston, not the hopeful mail-order bride from yesterday. Someone new. Someone yet to be defined. The kitchen was empty when she descended, but there was fresh coffee in the pot and evidence that the men had made some attempt at breakfast before heading out to their work. Lydia poured herself a cup, standing at the window and watching the ranch come to life in the early light. Cattle were moving in the distant pastures. Rowan was at one of the corrals, working with a young horse that kept shying away from his approach. Cal was mending fence near the barn, his movements methodical and efficient. It was a working ranch, she realized. Not just a place where men lived, but a business, an enterprise, something that required constant attention and care. And she was now part of it, whether she was ready or not. She started with the kitchen because that's where she was, and because tackling the entire house at once would be overwhelming. She heated water on the stove, found rags and soap, and began the systematic process of cleaning every surface, every dish, every pot and pan. She organized as she went, creating sensible systems where chaos had reigned. Pots with pots, plates with plates, dry goods grouped by type and stored in airtight containers to keep the mice out. She was elbow-deep in scrubbing the stove when Rowan appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, watching her with an expression that mixed surprise and something that might have been admiration. "You're already working," he said. "Did you think I was joking about the state of this kitchen?" Lydia didn't look up from her task. "This stove alone is going to take me half the day to restore to proper condition. I could help. You could stay out of my way and let me establish a system before you disrupt it." She softened the words with a slight smile. "I'm sure you have ranch work that needs your attention, Mr. Blackwell. Leave the house to me." He hesitated, and Lydia understood why. This was his space, his domain, and she was effectively asking him to cede control of it, but after a moment Rowan nodded slowly. "Fair enough, but you'll call me if you need anything, and we break for lunch at noon. Nothing fancy, just whatever's easy." and dinner's around 6, usually. I'll manage, Lydia assured him. Go, work. I promise your kitchen will still be here when you return. He left with visible reluctance, and Lydia smiled to herself as she returned to her scrubbing. For a man who'd claimed to want help managing his household, Rowan Blackwell seemed surprisingly attached to his chaotic bachelor ways. This might take more adjustment than either of them had anticipated. But as the morning wore on and the kitchen slowly transformed under her determined efforts, Lydia felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Useful. Not just present, not just surviving, but actively, purposefully useful. Every clean surface was a small victory. Every organized cupboard was evidence that she belonged here, that she had value, that the disaster of yesterday hadn't defeated her. Marcus appeared around mid-morning, ostensibly to fetch more coffee, but really, Lydia suspected, to check on her progress. He stopped in the doorway and whistled low. Well, I'll be damned, he said. Pardon my French, ma'am, but I haven't seen this kitchen look this good since ever, actually. Boss built this house 8 years ago, and it's never been this clean. It's not clean yet, Lydia corrected. It's merely in progress toward clean. There's a significant difference. If you say so, ma'am. Marcus poured himself coffee from the pot she'd scoured until it gleamed. But I'll tell you true, having you here is already making a difference. The boss, he tries, but he's not built for domestic work. His talents lie elsewhere. What about you? Lydia asked, taking a brief break from her scrubbing to accept the cup of coffee Marcus offered her. You seem to have been managing the cooking adequately. Adequately, Marcus chuckled. That's a kind word for it. I can make about 5 things, ma'am, and I make them all the same way. Throw ingredients in a pot and hope for the best. It fills bellies, but it's not what you'd call cuisine. Then perhaps you'd be willing to learn. The offer came out before Lydia had fully thought it through, but once spoken, she realized it made sense. I can teach you some basic techniques. Nothing fancy, but enough variety that you're not eating the same 5 meals in rotation. Marcus's weathered face lit up with genuine pleasure. You do that? Even though it's not strictly part of your duties? Keeping people fed is absolutely part of my duties, Lydia said firmly. And it's easier to teach someone who's willing to learn than to do everything myself. They spent the next hour working side by side, Marcus washing dishes while Lydia organized, and the older man proved to be a surprisingly good source of information about the ranch, the men, and Rowan himself. Boss came out here with nothing but determination and a chip on his shoulder the size of Denver, Marcus said as he scrubbed a particularly stubborn pot. He'd been a soldier, fought in the war, came home to find his family's farm had been sold off for taxes, and his sweetheart had married someone else. So he headed west like a lot of broken men do, figuring he'd either make something of himself or die trying. That's quite a story, Lydia said quietly. It's his story to tell, not mine, Marcus said with a meaningful look. But I figure you should know the basics, seeing as you'll be living under his roof. Rowan Blackwell is about the most honorable man I've ever met, ma'am. He took me on when nobody else would. I was too old, too worn out, too fond of the bottle. He gave me purpose and a place and trusted me to rise to it. And I've seen him do the same for others. Cal, he came to us 3 years back, running from some trouble down south. Boss didn't ask questions, just gave him work and let him prove himself. That's the kind of man he is. The picture Marcus was painting aligned with Lydia's own impressions from the previous evening, but it was good to have them confirmed. Rowan Blackwell collected strays and gave them chances, which meant she was in good company, even if being classified as a stray stung her pride slightly. By the time lunch rolled around, Lydia had made remarkable progress. The kitchen gleamed, the stove had been blacked and polished, and she'd managed to assemble a simple meal of bread, cheese, cold meat, and the last of Marcus's mysterious stew, which actually tasted better the second day. The men ate with the kind of focused appreciation that suggested they weren't used to having food presented on clean plates at a clean table, and Lydia felt a small glow of satisfaction at their obvious pleasure. This is nice, Cal said quietly, speaking directly to her for the first time since her arrival. Having things organized, civilized. It's nice. It's just a start, Lydia warned. The house needs a thorough top-to-bottom cleaning before I can truly organize it properly. It's going to get worse before it gets better. Let it get worse then, Rowan said, looking around the transformed kitchen with something like wonder. If this is what worse looks like, I can't wait to see better. That afternoon, while the men returned to their work, Lydia tackled the main room. She started by opening all the windows despite the chill wind, deciding that fresh air was more important than warmth. Then she began sorting, clothes to be washed, dishes to be cleaned, papers to be filed, trash to be discarded. She worked methodically, creating piles and categories, imposing order on chaos one small section at a time. She was in the middle of this when she heard horses approaching and voices raised in greeting. Lydia moved to the window and saw 3 riders pulling up to the house. 2 men and a woman, all mounted on good horses and dressed in what passed for Sunday clothes out here. Rowan emerged from the barn to greet them, and even from a distance, Lydia could see the tension in his posture. This wasn't a casual visit. The conversation was too far away for her to hear clearly, but it was animated, with lots of gesturing and what looked like heated words. After a few minutes, Rowan turned and walked toward the house, his expression grim, and Lydia quickly stepped back from the window, not wanting to be caught obviously eavesdropping. "Miss Monroe?" Rowan called from the front door. "Could you come out here for a moment?" Her stomach sank. Whatever this was, it wasn't good. But Lydia straightened her shoulders, smoothed down her apron, and stepped out onto the porch with her head high. The 3 visitors were now dismounted, and up close, Lydia could see they were all around her age, late 20s to early 30s. The woman was tall and striking, with blonde hair and sharp blue eyes that were currently fixed on Lydia with undisguised hostility. The 2 men flanking her looked uncomfortable, as if they'd been dragged into something they wanted no part of. "Miss Monroe," Rowan said, and there was steel in his voice. "These are my neighbors, Sarah Hendricks and her brothers, James and Thomas. They've ridden over from the Bar H to express concerns." "Concerns?" Lydia kept her voice neutral, though she had a sinking feeling she knew exactly what this was about. "About you," Sarah Hendricks said bluntly. "About your presence here, unchaperoned, living in a house with 3 unmarried men. It's improper, Miss Monroe. Scandalous, actually. And we won't have that kind of behavior in our community." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Lydia felt the familiar burn of humiliation rising in her chest. Less than 24 hours in this place, and already she was being judged, condemned, classified as something improper. She opened her mouth to respond, but Rowan stepped forward first, positioning himself slightly between Lydia and the Hendricks siblings. "Sarah," he said, and his voice was quiet but carried the kind of authority that made even the horses settle. "I don't recall asking for your opinion on how I run my household." "Your household affects the entire community," Sarah shot back, color rising in her cheeks. "What kind of example does this set? An unmarried woman living under your roof without even the pretense of propriety? People are already talking, Rowan. Mrs. Peterson saw you ride in with her yesterday, and by this morning the whole town knew that Charles Porter's mail-order bride had taken up residence at Broken Creek." "I'm not Charles Porter's anything," Lydia said, finding her voice at last. It came out harder than she'd intended, edged with the anger she'd been suppressing since yesterday. "Mr. Porter made that abundantly clear when he abandoned his commitment and left town rather than face me. And what I am now is Mr. Blackwell's employee, his housekeeper, which is a perfectly respectable position." "Respectable?" Sarah's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Living alone with 3 men in the middle of nowhere? There's nothing respectable about it, Miss Monroe. And if you had any sense of decency, you'd recognize that and remove yourself before you damage Mr. Blackwell's reputation beyond repair." "My reputation is my own concern," Rowan said, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "And I'll thank you to keep your judgments to yourself, Sarah. Miss Monroe is here at my invitation as my employee, with a proper contract and proper wages. What she does under my roof is between her, me, and God. It's certainly none of your business." James Hendricks, the older of the 2 brothers, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Rowan, maybe Sarah's got a point. Not about Miss Monroe's character," he added hastily when both Rowan and Lydia turned to look at him, "but about appearances. People talk. You know how it is in small towns. Maybe if there was some kind of chaperone, or if Miss Monroe stayed in town and came out during the day." "She stays here," Rowan cut him off flatly. In her own locked room, at the opposite end of the hall from mine, with Marcus and Cal in the bunkhouse. If that's not proper enough for the good people of Silver Ridge, then the good people of Silver Ridge can mind their own damn business. Language, Rowan, Sarah said primly, though her eyes flashed with something that looked like satisfaction, as if she'd been trying to provoke exactly this reaction. You're proving my point. This woman's presence is already making you crude and defensive. Lydia had heard enough. She'd spent too many years being talked about as if she weren't present, discussed and dismissed by people who thought they had the right to determine her fate. She stepped forward, moving around Rowan's protective stance to face Sarah Hendricks directly. Miss Hendricks, she said, keeping her voice level with effort, I understand your concern for propriety. Truly I do. But I wonder if that concern extends equally to the propriety of a man summoning a woman across an entire continent and then discarding her without even the courtesy of an explanation. Or does your sense of moral outrage only apply to women trying to survive after men have failed them? Sarah's face went rigid. That's hardly the same thing. Isn't it? Lydia felt months of suppressed fury bubbling up, all the fear and grief and desperation she'd been holding back since her mother's death. I came here in good faith. I had a contract, a promise, an agreement that was supposed to provide me with a future. And when that was taken away through no fault of my own, I was left with two choices: crawl back east in defeat or find another way forward. Mr. Blackwell offered me that way. He offered me honest work, fair wages, and most importantly, he offered me dignity. So forgive me if I'm not particularly moved by your concerns about appearances. Dignity? Sarah repeated, her voice dripping with scorn. Is that what you call it? Living in sin with a man you barely know? I'm not living in sin with anyone, Lydia said, her temper finally breaking free of its leash. I'm keeping house and managing accounts and working harder than I've worked in my entire life. And if you have a problem with that, Miss Hendricks, perhaps you should examine why the idea of a woman supporting herself through honest labor is more offensive to you than a man breaking his word. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Sarah's face had gone from flushed to white, her hands clenched at her sides. The brothers looked like they wanted to be anywhere but here, and Rowan was watching Lydia with an expression of mingled surprise and approval. I think it's time for you to leave, Rowan said quietly. All of you. You've said your piece, you've been answered, and there's nothing more to discuss. The community won't stand for this, Sarah said, but there was less conviction in her voice now. Pastor Williams will have something to say about it. The town council can say whatever they like, Rowan interrupted. Out here, I answer to no one but myself and my conscience. And my conscience is perfectly clear. Now get off my land before I forget we're neighbors and start treating you like trespassers. Thomas Hendricks, who'd been silent throughout the entire exchange, finally spoke up. Come on, Sarah. We've done what we came to do. Let's go home. For a moment, Lydia thought Sarah might refuse. The other woman's jaw was set in a stubborn line, her eyes still fixed on Lydia with open hostility. But finally, she turned on her heel and stalked back to her horse, mounting with the kind of angry grace that suggested she'd been riding since childhood. This isn't over, Rowan, she called as she wheeled her horse around. People will talk, they'll judge, and eventually they'll force you to choose between your precious reputation and your housekeeper. She spat the last word like a curse, then kicked her horse into a gallop, leaving her brothers to follow in her wake with apologetic backward glances. Lydia and Rowan stood in silence as the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. The confrontation had left her shaking, adrenaline singing through her veins, and she realized her hands were clenched so tightly her nails were digging into her palms. I'm sorry, she said finally. I shouldn't have lost my temper. I've made things worse for you. Worse? Rowan turned to look at her, and to her surprise, he was smiling. Miss Monroe, that was the most magnificent thing I've seen in months. The look on Sarah's face when you called her out on her hypocrisy. I'll be replaying that moment in my head for years. She's going to make trouble for us. You heard her. Sarah Hendricks has been making trouble since she learned to talk, Rowan said dismissively. She's had her eye on Broken Creek for years, thinking she could charm or bully her way into becoming Mrs. Blackwell and mistress of the best ranch in the valley. This isn't about morality or propriety. It's about jealousy. Lydia absorbed this information, turning it over in her mind. She wants to marry you. She wants to own me, Rowan corrected. There's a difference. Sarah doesn't want a husband. She wants a possession. And I'd rather die alone than spend my life being managed by someone who thinks marriage is a business transaction with romantic window dressing. There was bitter experience in his voice, and Lydia remembered what Marcus had said about a sweetheart who'd married someone else. She wondered if that woman had been anything like Sarah Hendricks, all surface beauty and sharp edges underneath. Still, she said quietly, I've brought scandal to your door on my first full day here. That's hardly the competent household management you were hoping for. You've brought life to my door, Rowan said, and backbone, and the first genuine laughter I've had in weeks. As for scandal, let them talk. Words can't hurt me, and they won't hurt you either as long as you're under my protection. The phrase under my protection sent a strange warmth through Lydia's chest, something she didn't want to examine too closely. It had been so long since anyone had offered to protect her from anything. Since her father's death, she'd been the one doing the protecting, of her mother, of her dignity, of the small shreds of her future. To have someone else shoulder that burden, even temporarily, was both relief and danger. I should get back to work, she said, needing to retreat before she said something she'd regret. The main room won't clean itself. But Rowan caught her arm gently as she turned to go. Miss Monroe. Lydia. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his rough voice made her pause. What you said to Sarah about dignity, that's exactly right. That's exactly what I wanted you to understand. You're not a charity case here. You're not someone to be pitied or managed or judged. You're my employee, yes, but more than that, you're a woman of worth trying to make her way in a world that doesn't make it easy. And anyone who can't see that can go straight to hell. Lydia looked up at him, this man who'd appeared in an alley less than 24 hours ago and offered her a lifeline when she'd been drowning. His storm-colored eyes were serious, sincere, and she saw in them an understanding that went deeper than simple kindness. He knew what it was to be discarded, to be judged, to have to rebuild from ruins. That's why he'd recognized it in her. Thank you, she said softly, for everything. For yesterday, for today, for standing up to your neighbors on my behalf. I won't forget it. Good, Rowan said, releasing her arm with a small smile. Now go terrorize my main room. I expect it'll be as unrecognizable as the kitchen by the time you're done with it. She spent the rest of the afternoon in a fury of cleaning that was as much about burning off the adrenaline from the confrontation as it was about actual household management. She scrubbed and sorted and organized with single-minded determination, and when Marcus came in for coffee around 3 o'clock, he took one look at her face and wisely retreated without saying a word. By dinner time, the main room had been transformed. The floor gleamed, the windows sparkled, the books were organized on their shelves by topic, and every surface was clear of clutter. Lydia had even managed to clean and oil the leather tack that had been lying around, arranging it neatly on pegs she'd found in one of the outbuildings. The room now looked like what it was supposed to be, a comfortable common space where people could gather, not a warehouse for everything its inhabitants were too lazy to put away properly. When the men came in for dinner, they stopped short in the doorway, staring. Lord above, Marcus breathed. It's like a different house entirely. I can actually see the floor, Cal added, wonder in his voice. I'd forgotten we had floor that nice. Rowan said nothing, just walked slowly through the room, taking in every detail. When he reached the fireplace, which Lydia had scrubbed until the stone shone, he turned to look at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You did all this in one afternoon? I had motivation, Lydia said dryly. Anger is an excellent catalyst for productivity. Remind me to make you angry more often, Rowan said, and there was genuine admiration in his voice. This is incredible, Miss Monroe. Truly. Dinner that night was simple but substantial. Lydia had found a ham in the smokehouse and roasted it with potatoes and carrots from the root cellar, along with bread she'd somehow found time to bake between cleaning sessions. The men ate like they were starving, and the conversation flowed more easily than it had the night before, as if the confrontation with the Hendricks had somehow broken down the last barriers of formality. Sarah was always like that, Marcus said when the topic inevitably turned to the afternoon's visitors. Even as a girl, she had to be the center of attention, had to control everything around her. Her mama died young, and her pa spoiled her rotten trying to make up for it. The brothers are decent enough, but they're scared of her. Always have been. She seemed particularly interested in Mr. Blackwell's marital status, Lydia observed, watching Rowan's reaction. She's been chasing him for 5 years, Cal said quietly. Ever since her pa died and left her the Bar H. She thought combining the ranches would make sense, and she figured Rowan would eventually see it the same way. The only thing that would make sense about marrying Sarah Hendricks is if I'd lost my mind completely, Rowan muttered. I'd rather marry a cactus. At least a cactus is honest about being prickly. Lydia couldn't help it. She laughed, a real laugh that bubbled up from somewhere deep and genuine. It felt strange after all the tension of the past 2 days to find something genuinely funny. A cactus, she repeated. That's quite an image. You laugh at me, but I'm serious, Rowan said, though his eyes were warm. At least with a cactus, you know where you stand. Sarah would smile at you while planning your destruction. The rest of the evening passed in comfortable companionship, and when Lydia finally retreated to her room around 9 o'clock, exhausted from the physical labor and emotional upheaval of the day, she felt something settling inside her, a sense of rightness, of belonging, that she hadn't expected to find so quickly. But 3 days later, she discovered that Sarah Hendricks hadn't been making idle threats. Lydia had ridden into town with Marcus to purchase supplies, her first trip back to Silver Ridge since her disastrous arrival. She'd been nervous about facing the townspeople again, but Rowan had insisted she needed to establish herself as part of the community rather than hiding at the ranch like she had something to be ashamed of. He'd arranged for Marcus to accompany her both for propriety and protection, and the older man had proven to be excellent company on the 6-mile ride, filling the time with stories about the early days of Colorado Territory. The general store was busy when they arrived, full of women doing their weekly shopping. The conversations died the moment Lydia stepped through the door, and she felt the weight of dozens of eyes assessing her, judging her, finding her wanting. She lifted her chin and walked to the counter with her list, determined not to show weakness. Thomas Brennan was behind the counter again. Charles Porter still hadn't returned from Denver, which told Lydia everything she needed to know about his character, and he greeted her with genuine warmth. "Miss Monroe, good to see you. How are you settling in at Broken Creek?" "Very well, thank you," Lydia said, handing him her list. Mr. Blackwell's household was in need of organization, but it's coming along nicely. The whispers started then, soft but audible. Lydia caught fragments. Living in sin. No shame. Poor Mr. Blackwell, taken in by a conniving woman. She kept her expression neutral, focused on Brennan as he gathered her supplies, but she could feel the hostility like a physical thing. An older woman approached then, someone Lydia didn't recognize. She had silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, and the kind of face that suggested she'd never smiled in her life. "You're the Monroe woman," she said without preamble. "The one who's staying out at Blackwell's place." "I am," Lydia confirmed, "though I prefer to think of myself as his housekeeper rather than the Monroe woman. A housekeeper who lives under the same roof as her employer, unchaperoned." The woman's voice dripped with disapproval. "In my day, we called that something other than housekeeping." Lydia felt Marcus stiffen beside her, but she laid a hand on his arm, stopping whatever he'd been about to say. This was her fight, and she needed to handle it herself. "In your day, ma'am," she said calmly, "women had fewer options for supporting themselves honorably. I'm fortunate to live in a time when a woman can work for fair wages without requiring a husband's permission or a chaperone's presence. I'm sorry if that offends your sensibilities, but I assure you, my conscience is perfectly clear." "Your conscience should be troubled," another woman chimed in, this one younger, with a pinched face and calculating eyes. "You're setting a terrible example for the young girls in this town, teaching them that morality doesn't matter as long as you have a roof over your head." "I'm teaching them nothing," Lydia said, her temper beginning to fray. "I'm simply living my life and doing my work. If you choose to make assumptions about my morality based on circumstances you don't understand, that says more about you than it does about me." "We understand perfectly well," the older woman said. "You came here as a mail-order bride, were rejected because of some failing in your character, and then latched onto the first man wealthy enough to keep you in comfort. You're an opportunist, and possibly worse." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and Lydia felt something inside her crack. All the grief she'd been holding back, all the fear and shame and desperate pride that had kept her moving forward through her mother's death and the loss of everything she'd known, it all came rushing up at once, and she found herself speaking before she could think better of it. "You want to know about my character?" Her voice was shaking now, not with fear but with fury. "I'll tell you. I watched my mother die slowly, painfully, because we couldn't afford proper medical care. I borrowed money from people who could barely spare it, trying to save her. I worked myself to exhaustion teaching children whose parents looked down on me because I had to work for my living. And when she died, I buried her in a pauper's grave and came west because I had nothing left, and no one who cared whether I lived or died." The store had gone completely silent. Even the whispers had stopped. "Charles Porter offered me a future," Lydia continued, the words pouring out like a dam had broken. "A practical arrangement, yes, but an honest one. Or so I thought. And when he broke that promise, when he discarded me like I was worth nothing, Rowan Blackwell offered me something I hadn't had in months. A choice. The choice to work, to earn my own way, to rebuild my life on my own terms. So judge me if you want. Condemn me, whisper about me, speculate about my virtue. But I know who I am and what I've survived, and your opinions don't change that." She turned to Brennan, who was staring at her with wide eyes. "Are my supplies ready?" "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly, "all packed and ready to go." "Good. Add it to Mr. Blackwell's account, please. Marcus, would you help me load the wagon?" She walked out of that store with her head high and her spine straight, and she didn't let herself cry until they were a mile outside of town, when Marcus pulled the wagon to a stop and handed her a handkerchief without comment. "I shouldn't have lost control like that," she said, wiping her eyes angrily. "I've made things worse." "You told the truth," Marcus said simply. "Sometimes that's all you can do. And for what it's worth, Miss Monroe, I think you've got more courage in your little finger than most of those women have in their whole bodies. It takes guts to survive what you've survived and still keep fighting." When they returned to Broken Creek, Rowan took one look at Lydia's face and immediately demanded to know what had happened. Marcus filled him in while Lydia busied herself putting away supplies, and she could hear Rowan's anger building with every word. "I'm going into town," he announced when Marcus finished. "I'm going to have words with every single person who thought they had the right to attack you." "No," Lydia said firmly. "You're not. That will only make things worse. They'll say I'm manipulating you, using feminine wiles to turn you against your neighbors. Let it be, Mr. Blackwell. I've faced worse than small-town gossip. That doesn't make it acceptable." "No," Lydia agreed, "but it makes it survivable, and survival is what I do best." But the trouble didn't end there. Over the next week, Lydia discovered that Sarah Hendricks had been busy spreading her poison far and wide. The pastor stopped by the ranch to express concerns about the arrangement, though Rowan sent him packing with a few choice words about minding his own business. 2 members of the town council wrote letters suggesting that Lydia's presence was damaging the community's moral fabric. And worst of all, several of Rowan's business associates began hinting that they might reconsider their dealings with him if he didn't resolve the situation. Through it all, Rowan remained steadfast in his support. He refused to ask Lydia to leave, refused to bend to public pressure, refused to treat her as anything other than a valued employee. But Lydia could see the strain it was causing him, the way he'd come in from town with tight shoulders and a grim expression, the way he'd spend evenings poring over ranch accounts with increasing worry. She was costing him. Her presence, her supposed impropriety, was damaging the reputation and business relationships he'd spent years building. And she didn't know how to fix it without leaving, which felt like giving up, like letting Charles Porter and Sarah Hendricks and all those judgmental women in the general store win. The breaking point came 2 weeks after her arrival at Broken Creek. Lydia was in the barn, collecting eggs from the henhouse, when she heard raised voices from the direction of the house. She hurried back to find 3 men on horseback confronting Rowan in the front yard, and even from a distance she could tell the conversation was heated. "We're not asking, Blackwell," one of the men was saying. He was heavy-set and prosperous-looking, with the kind of face that suggested he was used to getting his way. "We're telling. Either the woman goes or we take our business elsewhere. Simple as that." "Then take your business elsewhere," Rowan said flatly. Because Miss Monroe isn't going anywhere. Be reasonable, another man interjected. We understand you wanted to help her, that's admirable. But you've made your point. You've shown Christian charity. Now it's time to think about the bigger picture, about your standing in the community, about your business interests. My business interests are my own concern, Rowan said, and they don't include bowing to pressure from people who think they have the right to dictate how I run my household. Your household is affecting all of us, the first man argued. Our wives won't associate with anyone who does business with you. The church is talking about censure. The town council is considering formal sanctions, all because you're too stubborn to see sense about one woman who isn't even family. That was when Lydia stepped forward, decision crystallizing in her mind with perfect clarity. She couldn't let Rowan destroy everything he'd built for her sake. She wouldn't be that kind of burden. Mr. Blackwell, she said quietly, and all four men turned to look at her. Perhaps I could speak with you privately for a moment? Rowan's jaw was set in a stubborn line, but he nodded curtly. Gentlemen, if you'll excuse us. He followed Lydia into the house, and once they were inside with the door closed, she turned to face him with her mind made up. I'm leaving, she said. I'll pack my things tonight and take the morning stage to Denver. From there, I can make my way back east or find another position somewhere else, somewhere where my presence won't damage you. Absolutely not. Rowan's response was immediate and fierce. I won't let those hypocrites drive you away. This is exactly what they want, to prove that money and social pressure can override basic decency and fairness. And what good does it do to prove them wrong if it costs you everything? Lydia asked. You heard those men. You're losing business, losing standing in the community, possibly facing sanctions from the town council. All because of me. I won't be responsible for that. You're not responsible for their small-mindedness and prejudice, Rowan argued. You're the victim here, Lydia. You came here in good faith and got abandoned. You've worked harder than any person I've ever hired. You've transformed this house, managed my accounts better than I ever could, and brought order to chaos. And you're telling me I should throw all that away because some narrow-minded fools can't accept the idea of a woman earning an honest living? I'm telling you that I've seen what happens when principle crashes into reality, Lydia said, her voice breaking despite her best efforts to stay calm. I've watched good people lose everything because they wouldn't compromise. My father died still owing money because he wouldn't cheat his creditors even when everyone told him to. My mother worked herself to death trying to maintain standards that no one else cared about. I won't watch you do the same thing for me. Then you don't know me very well, Rowan said, and he stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his gray eyes, close enough to feel the heat radiating from him. Because I don't compromise on things that matter. And you matter, Lydia. Not just as an employee, not just as someone I'm helping out of charity. You matter as a person, as someone who deserves better than what this world has given you. And I'll be damned if I let them take that away. The intensity in his voice, the way he was looking at her, it made Lydia's breath catch in her throat. This wasn't about principle anymore, she realized with sudden clarity. This was about something else, something neither of them was quite ready to name. Before she could respond, the door burst open and Marcus stumbled in, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. Boss, he gasped. We've got trouble, real trouble. Rustlers hit the north pasture. They've got at least 50 head, maybe more, and they're armed. Just like that, the moment shattered. Rowan's expression shifted from intense to focused, all business now. He grabbed his gun belt from where it hung by the door, buckling it on with practiced efficiency. How many? He demanded. Cal counted 6, but there could be more. They're moving the cattle toward the pass, probably trying to get them over the ridge before we can mount a response. Rowan was already moving toward the door when Lydia grabbed his arm. Wait, you can't just ride out there alone. If they're armed, I'm not alone. I've got Marcus and Cal, and we don't have time to get help from town. He looked at her, and his expression softened slightly. Stay in the house. Lock the doors. There's a rifle above the mantel and ammunition in the drawer below it. If anyone comes near this house who isn't one of us, you shoot first and ask questions later. Understand? Rowan, promise me, Lydia. He gripped her shoulders, urgent and fierce. Promise me you'll stay safe. I promise, she whispered, but you have to promise me the same thing. Come back. He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded once, sharply. I always do. And then he was gone, Marcus at his heels, leaving Lydia alone in the suddenly too quiet house. She could hear horses thundering away, shouts in the distance, the sharp crack of what might have been gunfire echoing off the mountains. For perhaps 10 minutes, Lydia stood frozen in the middle of the main room, listening to her heart pound and fighting the urge to run after them. She'd promised to stay safe. But the idea of hiding while Rowan rode into danger felt wrong, felt cowardly, felt like everything she'd promised herself she'd never be again. Then she heard it, the sound of horses approaching from the south, from the direction opposite where the rustling was supposedly happening. Wrong direction, wrong timing, wrong everything. Lydia moved to the window and felt her blood run cold. 4 riders were approaching the house at a steady pace, and even from a distance, she could tell they weren't friendly. They rode with the kind of casual menace that spoke to bad intentions, and they were heavily armed. The rustling in the north pasture had been a diversion, she realized with sudden, sick clarity. A way to draw Rowan and his men away from the house, leaving it vulnerable. Leaving her vulnerable. She thought about her promise to Rowan, about staying safe and hiding. She thought about all the times in her life she'd been passive, accepting, letting things happen to her rather than taking action. She thought about her mother's face as she was dying, about Charles Porter's cowardly letter, about every moment of helplessness she'd endured. And then Lydia Monroe made a choice. She retrieved the rifle from above the mantel, loaded it with hands that shook only slightly, and checked to make sure she knew how to work the mechanism. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was younger, clay pigeons and targets, gentleman's recreation, and she'd been good at it. Steady hands, clear eye, patience. She wondered if those skills would translate to this moment, to this necessity. The riders were closer now, spreading out as they approached the house. Lydia positioned herself at the front window where she'd have a clear line of sight, and she called out through the glass in a voice that sounded far steadier than she felt. "That's close enough, gentlemen. This is private property, and you're not welcome here." One of the men laughed, a sound that made Lydia's skin crawl. Private property with no one to defend it. Blackwell rode out like we knew he would, and his old man and the Negro went with him. That leaves just you, sweet thing. Why don't you open that door and we can discuss this in a more friendly manner? "I have a rifle," Lydia said, "and I know how to use it. Turn around and leave now, and I won't need to prove it." "A rifle don't mean much if you're too scared to pull the trigger," another man said. He dismounted, bold as brass, and started walking toward the porch. Women don't have the stomach for killing. Everyone knows that. Lydia's finger found the trigger. She thought about her promise to Rowan, about staying safe, but she also thought about everything she'd learned in the past weeks, that sometimes safety came from action, not passivity, that sometimes you had to fight for the life you wanted rather than accepting the one you were given. She aimed for the ground about 2 feet in front of the approaching man and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder, harder than she'd expected, and the shot rang out like thunder. Dirt exploded where the bullet hit, and the man stumbled backward with a startled oath that would have made a sailor blush. "The next one goes through your knee," Lydia called out, already reloading with movements that felt awkward but functional. "After that, I work my way up. Test me if you'd like, but I promise you'll regret it." The 4 men looked at each other, clearly reassessing the situation. A woman alone was one thing. A woman alone with a rifle and the will to use it was something else entirely. "You can't guard that house forever," the apparent leader said. "Sooner or later you'll have to sleep, and when I do, Mr. Blackwell will be back with his men and possibly the sheriff," Lydia interrupted. "Do you really want to be here when that happens? Because I'm fairly certain rustling carries a hanging offense in Colorado territory." There was a long, tense moment when it could have gone either way. Lydia kept the rifle steady, her heart hammering so hard she was surprised they couldn't hear it, and waited to see if her bluff would hold. Finally, the leader spat on the ground in disgust. "This ain't over. You tell Blackwell he's made powerful enemies. And you, girl, you're going to regret not being more friendly when you had the chance." They rode off at a canter, throwing threatening looks over their shoulders, and Lydia waited until they were out of sight before she let herself lower the rifle. Her hands were shaking violently now, reaction setting in, and she had to sit down hard on the nearest chair before her legs gave out entirely. She'd done it. She'd faced down 4 armed men and sent them running with nothing but an old rifle and more courage than good sense. Her father would have been proud. Her mother would have been horrified. and Lydia herself didn't quite know what to feel except a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. She was still sitting there, rifle across her lap, when the sound of hoofbeats announced another arrival. But this time she recognized the rhythm, recognized Rowan's distinctive mount and the way he rode, slightly favoring his left side to accommodate his old injury. Lydia stumbled to the door and out onto the porch, and the relief that flooded through her when she saw all three men returning safely was so intense it made her lightheaded. Rowan took one look at her face, at the rifle still clutched in her hands, and was off his horse and up the porch steps in seconds. "What happened?" he demanded. "Are you hurt?" "I heard shooting." "I'm fine," Lydia said, and started laughing, a slightly hysterical sound even to her own ears. "I'm fine. There were 4 men. They came from the south while you were dealing with the rustlers in the north, and I shot at them. Well, near them. I shot near them, and they left." Rowan went very still. 4 men came here, to the house, while I was gone? "It was a setup," Lydia explained, her words tumbling over each other in her haste to get them out. "The rustling was a diversion to draw you away. They thought the house would be undefended, thought I'd be easy prey, but I had the rifle and I remembered my promise to you about shooting first, so I did. And they left." She was babbling now, she knew, but she couldn't seem to stop. Rowan's hands came up to grip her shoulders, grounding her, and she focused on his face, on the concern there, the anger, and something else that looked like awe. "You defended the house," he said slowly, as if testing the words. "Alone, against 4 armed men." "I shot near one of them," Lydia corrected. "I didn't actually hit anyone, though I told them the next shot would go through his knee, and I think they believed me." "Because they should have believed you." Rowan's grip tightened just slightly. "My God, Lydia. Do you have any idea how dangerous that was? How badly it could have gone?" "Do you have any idea how dangerous rustlers are?" Lydia shot back. "You rode off to confront them with just Marcus and Cal. We were all taking risks today." She saw the moment he recognized the truth in that, saw the argument die on his lips. And then, to her complete surprise, Rowan Blackwell started to laugh, a full, genuine sound that transformed his whole face. "We're quite a pair, aren't we?" he said when he could speak again. "Both too stubborn to back down, both too foolish to run from danger. It's a miracle we're both still standing." "Stubbornness is a virtue when applied correctly," Lydia informed him with as much dignity as she could muster. "And foolishness is just bravery that hasn't been vindicated yet. Is that what we're calling it?" But Rowan was still smiling, and his hands were still on her shoulders, and Lydia was suddenly very aware of how close they were standing, how the afternoon light caught in his hair, how his eyes had warmed from storm gray to something softer. The moment stretched between them, weighted with possibility, with things unspoken. And for the first time since stepping off that train, Lydia let herself wonder if maybe, just maybe, she'd found something more valuable than the practical marriage she'd come seeking. Maybe she'd found something real. Marcus cleared his throat loudly from somewhere behind them, shattering the moment like dropped glass. Rowan stepped back, his hands falling away from Lydia's shoulders, and she felt the loss of his warmth like a physical thing. "We should check the perimeter," Marcus said tactfully, not quite meeting either of their eyes. "Make sure those men actually left and aren't circling back for another try." "Right," Rowan said, his voice rougher than usual. "Cal, take the west side. Marcus, you've got east. I'll ride north and make sure the rustlers are actually gone and not regrouping. Miss Monroe, please go inside and bolt the door. I know you can handle yourself, but I'd rest easier knowing you're secure." Lydia wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could help with the patrol, but the rational part of her brain recognized that she'd used up her day's allotment of reckless bravery. Her hands were still trembling with delayed shock, and she could feel exhaustion creeping in at the edges of her adrenaline high. "I'll make coffee," she said instead. "Strong coffee. I suspect we're all going to need it." She watched from the window as the 3 men split up and rode out in different directions, and only when they were out of sight did she allow herself to sink into a chair and let the full reality of what had just happened wash over her. She'd shot at a man, actually pulled the trigger and sent a bullet into the ground at his feet. The Lydia Monroe who taught poetry to proper Boston schoolgirls would never have believed herself capable of such an action. But then, that Lydia Monroe had died somewhere between her mother's grave and the Silver Ridge train platform. The woman who'd emerged from those ashes was someone different, someone harder and braver, and maybe a little bit reckless. Someone who shot at threats and spoke back to hypocrites, and felt her heart race when a certain rancher looked at her with storm-colored eyes. The coffee was brewing when she heard riders approaching again, but this time there were more of them. Lydia grabbed the rifle and moved to the window, then relaxed when she recognized Rowan's tall form among what appeared to be at least a dozen mounted men. The sheriff's badge on one rider's vest caught the late afternoon light, and she realized Rowan must have encountered a patrol on his way back. She set the rifle aside and went out onto the porch to meet them. The sheriff was a grizzled man in his 50s with the kind of face that had seen everything and been surprised by none of it. He tipped his hat to her as he dismounted. "Ma'am, I'm Sheriff Tom Cassidy. Mr. Blackwell here tells me you had some trouble this afternoon." 4 men came to the house while Mr. Blackwell and his men were dealing with rustlers in the north pasture, Lydia confirmed. They made threatening statements, and one of them approached the house despite my warnings. I fired a warning shot, and they left. "You got a good look at them? Could identify them if you saw them again?" Lydia closed her eyes, calling up the details she'd been too frightened to consciously register at the time. The leader was about 5'10", heavy build, dark beard with some gray in it. He had a scar across his left cheek, quite prominent. The one who dismounted was younger, maybe mid-20s, with red hair and freckles. I didn't get as clear a view of the other two, but one was very tall and thin, and the other had a limp. When she opened her eyes, the sheriff was looking at her with newfound respect. "That's quite a detailed description, ma'am. Most people panic and can't remember a thing." "I'm a teacher," Lydia said. "Or I was. Observing details is part of the profession." "The Garson gang," one of the deputies said suddenly. "Has to be. That description matches Jake Garson and his brother Pete to a fault. They've been hitting ranches all up and down the valley for the past 6 months." "Garson?" The sheriff's expression darkened. "That makes sense. They've been getting bolder, more organized. A coordinated attack like this is exactly their style. Create a diversion, hit the real target while everyone's distracted." He turned to Rowan. "You have any idea why they'd target you specifically? The rustling alone would have been profitable enough." Rowan's jaw tightened. "I've made some enemies recently. People who don't approve of my hiring choices." His glance flickered to Lydia. "It's possible someone pointed Garson in my direction, suggested the ranch would be vulnerable." "Sarah Hendricks," Lydia said quietly, the pieces falling into place. "She was here 2 weeks ago making threats. She said we'd made powerful enemies." "Now hold on," the sheriff interrupted. "Sarah Hendricks is a lot of things, but I can't see her consorting with outlaws." "That's a serious accusation, Miss Monroe." "I'm not accusing her of direct involvement," Lydia clarified, "but she's been spreading word all over town about how Broken Creek is poorly defended, how Mr. Blackwell is distracted by improper domestic arrangements. If the wrong people heard that kind of talk, they might see an opportunity," the sheriff finished grimly. "Damn it, pardon my language, ma'am, but this is exactly the kind of mess I was afraid of when all that gossip started flying. Words have consequences, and when people start throwing around accusations and stirring up trouble, sometimes the wrong element takes notice." He organized his men to do a thorough sweep of the property, looking for any signs of the Garson gang or evidence of their escape route. Lydia retreated inside to prepare food for the unexpected crowd, and within an hour, the kitchen was full of lawmen drinking coffee and eating the simple beef sandwiches she'd managed to assemble from cold roast and fresh bread. "You got a good setup here, Blackwell," the sheriff said around a mouthful of sandwich. "This is the best meal I've had in weeks. Your housekeeper's got talent." "Miss Monroe has many talents," Rowan said, and there was pride in his voice that made Lydia's cheeks warm, including a steady hand with a rifle and the good sense to use it when needed. "About that," Sheriff Cassidy said, turning his attention to Lydia. "I'll need you to come into town tomorrow and make an official statement. We're going to put out warrants for the Garson gang based on this incident, and your testimony will be crucial. That description you gave me, that's evidence that could help us finally bring them in." Lydia nodded, though the thought of returning to Silver Ridge and facing all those judgmental faces again made her stomach clench. "Of course, Sheriff. Whatever helps." "I'll bring her in myself," Rowan said, first thing in the morning. The sheriff and his men left as the sun was setting, promising to increase patrols in the area and warning Rowan to stay vigilant. When the last of them had ridden away, The ranch settled into an uneasy quiet that felt nothing like the peaceful evenings Lydia had been growing accustomed to. Dinner that night was subdued. Cal had managed to recover most of the stolen cattle. The rustlers had abandoned them once they realized the real prize at the house wasn't going to be as easy as they'd expected. But everyone was on edge, jumping at shadows, aware that danger might return at any moment. "I'll take first watch," Marcus announced as they finished eating. "Cal can relieve me at midnight, then you at 4, boss." "I can help," Lydia offered. Lydia saw it. "I can keep watch just as well as any of you." "No offense, Miss Monroe," Cal said quietly, "but you did your share of fighting today. Let us handle the night watch." She wanted to argue, but the exhaustion she'd been fighting all evening finally caught up with her. The adrenaline had long since faded, leaving her feeling hollowed out and shaky. She nodded reluctantly and excused herself to her room, though she doubted sleep would come easily. It didn't. Lydia lay in bed listening to the sounds of the house settling, the creak of floorboards as Marcus made his rounds, the distant call of a nightbird. Every noise seemed magnified, potentially threatening, and she found herself reliving those terrifying minutes when she'd faced down 4 armed men with nothing but borrowed courage and her father's long-ago shooting lessons. She must have dozed eventually, because she woke to the sound of raised voices and the acrid smell of smoke. For a disoriented moment, she thought she was dreaming, but then she heard Rowan shouting and the unmistakable crackle of fire. Lydia threw off her blankets and ran to the window. Orange light flickered in the darkness. The barn was burning, flames already climbing the wooden walls and reaching for the roof. She could see figures running, hear horses screaming in panic, and her heart seized with terror. She dressed faster than she'd ever dressed in her life, yanking on her work dress and boots without bothering with half her buttons, and raced downstairs. The main room was empty, everyone already outside fighting the fire. Lydia grabbed buckets from the kitchen and ran toward the barn, where organized chaos reigned. Rowan and Cal were leading horses out of the burning structure, their faces streaked with soot and sweat. Marcus was at the well, hauling up water as fast as the mechanism would allow. And several ranch hands Lydia hadn't met before had apparently arrived from wherever they'd been working to form a bucket brigade. "The north wall!" Rowan was shouting. "Concentrate water on the north wall before it spreads to the hay storage." Lydia took her place in the line, passing buckets with trembling arms, her eyes stinging from smoke. The heat was incredible, pressing against her face like a physical force, and the sound of the fire was deafening, a roar and crackle that seemed to devour everything in its path. They fought for what felt like hours, but was probably only 40 minutes, working with desperate efficiency to contain the blaze before it could spread to the other outbuildings or, God forbid, the house. Gradually, painfully, they gained ground. The flames died from roar to crackle to sullen smolder, and finally to smoking ruins. When it was over, when the last ember had been doused and everyone stood gasping and exhausted in the pre-dawn darkness, Rowan surveyed the damage with an expression that made Lydia's heart ache. Half the barn was gone, reduced to charred timbers and ash. The rest was badly damaged, maybe salvageable with extensive repairs, but it would never be what it was. "Garson," Marcus said flatly, breaking the silence. "Has to be. This is retaliation for this afternoon." "Or a message," Cal added, his voice grim. "Showing us they can hit us any time they want." Rowan said nothing, just stood there with his fists clenched and his jaw set, and Lydia could practically see him calculating the cost. In materials, in time, in the security and stability he'd worked 8 years to build. "This is my fault," she said, the words torn from somewhere deep and guilty. "If I hadn't come here, if I'd just gone back east like Charles Porter intended, none of this would have happened. You wouldn't have made enemies over me. The Garson gang wouldn't have targeted you. Your barn would still be standing." "Stop." Rowan's voice cut through her self-recrimination like a blade. "Don't you dare take responsibility for the actions of criminals and cowards. The Garson gang burned my barn because they're thieves and vandals. Sarah Hendricks spread her poison because she's jealous and mean-spirited. None of that is on you, Lydia. None of it. But if you left, I'd rebuild the barn alone and angry, without even the consolation of knowing I stood up for something that mattered." He turned to face her fully, and in the dim light from the dying embers, his eyes were fierce. Do you understand what you did today? You didn't just defend this house. You showed me that I was right to trust you, right to believe you were stronger than circumstances. Every person who said you didn't belong here, who called you improper or opportunistic or worse, you proved them wrong. And I won't let you walk away from that victory just because some bastards decided to burn down a building. Lydia felt tears prick her eyes, though whether from smoke or emotion she couldn't say. Your barn, Rowan, your livelihood, is insured, he said firmly, and can be rebuilt. What can't be rebuilt is integrity, once you've compromised it. I told you when you arrived that I don't back down from things that matter. Did you think I was lying? No, Lydia whispered, but I didn't think I'd matter this much. The words hung between them, raw and honest, and Lydia saw something shift in Rowan's expression. He took a step toward her, then seemed to remember they had an audience. Marcus and Cal and the ranch hands were all studiously looking anywhere but at the two of them, but they were definitely still present, definitely still listening. We'll talk later, Rowan said quietly, after I've dealt with the sheriff and started making plans for rebuilding. But Lydia, you're not leaving, not unless you want to, and not because anyone else tells you to. That's non-negotiable. The sheriff and his deputies returned at dawn, drawn by reports of the fire visible from town. Sheriff Cassidy took one look at the burned barn and swore viciously. This is escalating faster than I'd like, he admitted. The Garson gang has always been opportunistic, but this kind of direct attack, this kind of vendetta, it's new and dangerous. What can you do about it? Rowan asked, his voice flat with exhaustion. I'm putting together a proper posse. Real deputies, armed and ready to track these bastards down before they hit another ranch. But in the meantime, you need to be careful, Blackwell. Keep guards posted, don't travel alone, and for God's sake, keep that housekeeper of yours close. She's proven she can handle trouble, but she's also clearly become a target. They spent the morning giving statements and helping the sheriff's men search for evidence of how the fire had been started. They found traces of lamp oil on the ground near where the blaze had begun, proof of arson, as if anyone had doubted it. The ride into town for Lydia's official statement felt surreal after the long, violent night. She sat beside Rowan on the wagon bench, both of them too exhausted for conversation, and watched the landscape pass in a blur of gold and green and distant blue mountains. Silver Ridge was bustling when they arrived, and the news of the barn burning had clearly preceded them. People stopped on the boardwalks to stare as they passed, and Lydia heard the whispers starting before they'd even reached the sheriff's office. That's her, the one who shot at the Garson gang. Heard she defended Blackwell's ranch single-handed while he was off chasing rustlers. My Tom said she gave the best description of suspects he's heard in 20 years of law enforcement. The tone was different now, Lydia noticed with surprise. Still curious, still speculative, but no longer quite so condemning. It seemed that standing up to outlaws with a rifle earned a woman a different kind of reputation than merely keeping house for an unmarried man. Her statement to the sheriff took nearly an hour. She described everything in precise detail, the four men's appearance, their words, their movements, the shot she'd fired, and why. Sheriff Cassidy took notes in careful handwriting, occasionally asking clarifying questions, and when it was done, he leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. This is good work, Miss Monroe. With this testimony, combined with what we found at the barn, I can issue warrants for the entire Garson gang. Judge Mitchell is in town today. I'll take this to him this afternoon and have paper on them by evening. Will that stop them? Lydia asked. Warrants don't seem like much protection against men willing to burn buildings in the middle of the night. No, but it gives us legal authority to shoot if they resist arrest, and it means every lawman in 3 counties will be looking for them. They'll have to run far and fast, and running men make mistakes. He stood, offering Lydia his hand. You did the right thing yesterday, ma'am. Not many people would have had the courage to stand their ground like you did. I didn't feel courageous, Lydia admitted. I felt terrified. That's what courage is, the sheriff said simply. Being terrified and acting anyway. When they emerged from the sheriff's office, they found a small crowd had gathered outside. At its center stood Sarah Hendricks, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed, flanked by her brothers who looked profoundly uncomfortable. Mr. Blackwell, Sarah said, her voice shaking. Miss Monroe, I need to speak with you both. Rowan's expression went cold. I don't think we have anything to say to each other, Miss Hendricks. Please. Sarah took a step forward, and Lydia was startled to see what looked like genuine distress on the other woman's face. I heard about the fire, about the attack yesterday, and I need you to know I had nothing to do with it. Nothing. I may have spoken unwisely about your domestic arrangements, but I would never associate with criminals or encourage violence. Your words had consequences whether you intended them or not, Rowan said flatly. You spent weeks telling anyone who would listen that Broken Creek was vulnerable, that I was distracted, that my household was improperly defended. The Garson gang heard that talk and saw an opportunity. So forgive me if I'm not particularly interested in your disclaimers now. Sarah flinched as if he'd struck her. You're right. You're absolutely right. I was angry and jealous, and I said terrible things, and I can't take them back. But I can try to make amends. She turned to address the crowd that had gathered. I want everyone here to know that I was wrong about Miss Monroe. Wrong about her character. Wrong about her intentions. Wrong about everything. She's proven herself to be a woman of courage and integrity, and Broken Creek is lucky to have her. Anyone who continues to spread gossip or make trouble over her employment will answer to me. The silence that followed was absolute. James Hendricks was staring at his sister like he'd never seen her before, and Thomas was nodding slowly, as if something had finally made sense to him. Lydia found her voice first. Why? She asked quietly. Why this change of heart? Because I heard what you did yesterday, Sarah said, meeting Lydia's eyes directly for the first time. How you defended that ranch alone. How you faced down 4 armed men without flinching. And I realized that you're everything I've always wanted to be, but was too afraid to try. Strong, independent, brave enough to make your own way in the world instead of trying to marry into security. Her voice broke slightly. I've been cruel to you because I envied you, and I'm sorry, truly sorry. It wasn't a complete apology. It didn't erase the damage Sarah's gossip had done, or the dangers it had created. But it was honest, raw, in a way that suggested it had cost Sarah considerable pride to make, and Lydia found she couldn't hold on to her anger in the face of such obvious contrition. I appreciate your honesty, she said carefully, and I hope in the future you'll channel your strength into building up rather than tearing down. Sarah nodded jerkily, tears now streaming down her face. I will. I promise I will. And if there's anything I can do to help rebuild the barn, or to make amends in any way, there is one thing, Rowan said, and his voice had softened slightly. You can use your influence in this town for good instead of gossip. You can make sure people know the truth about what happened, about who's really at fault here. The Garson gang terrorized my ranch and my people. Don't let anyone rewrite that story to make it about something else. I won't, Sarah promised. You have my word. They left her there in the street, still surrounded by onlookers, and Lydia felt some of the tension she'd been carrying for weeks finally begin to ease. It wasn't a complete victory. There would still be gossip, still be judgment, still be people who disapproved of her unconventional situation. But the tide had shifted, and that shift felt significant. The ride back to Broken Creek was quieter than the journey in, but it was a comfortable quiet this time. Rowan seemed lost in thought, his hands steady on the reins, and Lydia found herself studying his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way the afternoon light caught in his dark hair, the small scar above his left eyebrow that she'd never noticed before. You're staring, Rowan said without looking at her, but there was amusement in his voice. I'm observing, Lydia corrected primly. There's a difference. Is there now? He did turn then, catching her gaze with his own, and the warmth in his storm-gray eyes made her breath catch. And what observations have you made? Lydia felt heat rise in her cheeks but refused to look away. That you're a man who keeps his word even when it costs him. That you value integrity over convenience. That you're stubborn and protective and perhaps a little too willing to sacrifice your own interests for the sake of principle. That sounds like criticism. It's admiration, Lydia said softly. Though I reserve the right to find your stubbornness exasperating on occasion. Rowan smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire face. Fair enough. And what would you say if I told you I had some observations of my own? I'd say you're entitled to your opinions, even if they're wrong. He laughed at that, the sound rich and genuine. I don't think I'm wrong about this. I think you're one of the strongest people I've ever met, I think you've been handed nothing but hardship and loss, and you've turned it into determination and courage. I think you shoot straighter than most of my ranch hands and organize better than any 3 people I know. And I think—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I think I was wrong when I said I just needed a housekeeper." Lydia's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. "What do you need, then?" "I need a partner," Rowan said quietly. "Someone who'll stand beside me when trouble comes instead of hiding behind me. Someone who'll tell me when I'm being stubborn and challenge me to be better. Someone who turns a house into a home just by being in it." He pulled the wagon to a stop there in the middle of the road, miles from anywhere, with nothing but mountains and skies surrounding them. When he turned to face her fully, Lydia saw something in his expression that made her pulse race, hope and fear and longing all mixed together. "Lydia Monroe," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I know you came west looking for security and practical partnership. I know you've only been here a few weeks, and we barely know each other. But I also know that you've changed everything for me. You've reminded me what it means to fight for something that matters, to build a life instead of just surviving one. And I'd be honored, more honored than I can say, if you'd consider staying. Not as my employee, as my wife." For a long moment, Lydia couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare at this man who'd offered her dignity when she'd expected charity, who'd defended her when the whole town condemned her, who'd just proposed marriage in the middle of a dusty road with more sincerity than Charles Porter had shown in 6 months of carefully composed letters. "I came here expecting a practical arrangement," she finally said, her voice shaking. "A marriage of convenience with a man I'd never met. And what you're offering me now is anything but practical, Rowan Blackwell. It's messy and complicated, and we'll probably drive each other mad on a regular basis." She saw his expression start to fall, saw him beginning to withdraw, and she reached out to catch his hand before he could pull completely away. "But it's also real," she continued, holding his gaze. "It's honest and true and built on actually knowing each other, on respect and partnership, and something that feels dangerously close to love. So yes, I'll marry you. Not because I need security or because I have nowhere else to go, but because I choose you, because you're the best man I've ever met, and I'd be a fool to walk away from that." The kiss that followed was tentative at first, as if they were both afraid of breaking the fragile, precious thing growing between them. But then Rowan's hand came up to cup her cheek, gentle and sure, and Lydia leaned into the touch, into him, and the kiss deepened into something that felt like a promise and a homecoming all at once. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Rowan rested his forehead against hers and smiled. "We're going to scandalize the town all over again, you know, rushing into marriage after just a few weeks." "Let them talk," Lydia said firmly. "We've survived worse than gossip. We can survive anything as long as we're together." And as they continued the journey home to the ranch that would now truly be her home, to the life they would build together from ashes and determination and unexpected love, Lydia felt something she hadn't felt since before her father died. She felt hope. Not the desperate, fragile hope that had brought her west on a stranger's promise, but solid, certain hope built on truth and tested by fire. She'd come to Colorado as an unwanted bride, discarded before she'd even arrived. But she was leaving that road as a chosen partner, heading toward a future she'd helped create, and that made all the difference in the world. The news of their engagement spread through Silver Ridge faster than the fire that had consumed the barn, and the reactions were as varied as the people themselves. Some celebrated the romance of it all, the mail-order bride who'd been rejected finding true love with the honorable rancher. Others clucked their tongues and predicted disaster, convinced that any relationship built on such unconventional foundations was doomed to failure. But Lydia found she cared less about public opinion with each passing day, too busy helping plan the barn reconstruction and preparing for a wedding that would be nothing like the practical arrangement she'd originally envisioned. Rowan insisted on doing things properly despite the rushed timeline. He rode into town and spoke with Pastor Williams, who agreed to perform the ceremony despite his earlier reservations about their living situation. He commissioned a local carpenter to build Lydia a proper wardrobe for the bedroom they would share, one large enough to hold all her possessions with room to grow. And most importantly, he sat down with her every evening after the day's work was done and talked, really talked, about what their marriage would look like, what they both wanted from it, what fears they carried and hopes they harbored. "I won't be an easy husband," Rowan admitted one night as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge. "I'm set in my ways. Stubborn as Marcus keeps reminding me, and I have a tendency to shoulder burdens alone rather than asking for help." "And I won't be an easy wife," Lydia countered, leaning back against the porch railing. "I'm opinionated and independent, and I'll expect to be consulted on decisions that affect our life together. I won't be decorative or silent or content to simply manage your household while you manage everything else." "Good," Rowan said simply. "I don't want decorative or silent. I want a partner who will call me on my nonsense and push me to be better. Someone who will stand beside me when times are hard and celebrate with me when they're good. That's what marriage should be, I think. Not one person serving the other, but two people building something together that neither could build alone." It was perhaps the most romantic thing Lydia had ever heard, made more so by the complete sincerity with which Rowan spoke it. She reached across the space between them and took his hand, marveling at how natural the gesture had become in just a few short weeks. "When should we marry?" she asked. "I know there are conventions about engagement periods and proper planning, but under the circumstances—" "2 weeks," Rowan said immediately. "Long enough to rebuild the barn to the point where we can hold a proper celebration. Short enough that we're not testing the town's tolerance for propriety any more than we already have. Does that suit you?" 2 weeks felt simultaneously like too long and not nearly enough time, but Lydia nodded, squeezing his hand. 2 weeks. That gives me time to make a proper dress and you time to finish the barn. We'll invite the whole town, feed them well, and show them exactly what kind of marriage we intend to have." "Scandalous and happy?" Rowan suggested with a grin. "Precisely." The next morning brought unexpected visitors in the form of Sarah Hendricks and 3 other women from town, all carrying baskets and wearing expressions that ranged from cautiously friendly to genuinely warm. Lydia was in the kitchen kneading bread dough when she heard the knock, and she wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron before answering the door. "Miss Monroe," Sarah said, and there was none of the hostility from their first meeting in her voice now. "We heard about your engagement, and we wanted to offer our congratulations, and our help, if you'll accept it." Lydia studied the 4 women carefully, looking for signs of mockery or hidden agendas, but found only sincere goodwill. The woman standing next to Sarah was perhaps 40, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. She stepped forward with a warm smile. "I'm Margaret Chen, Mrs. Chen's daughter-in-law. We met briefly on the train, I believe. My mother-in-law spoke very highly of you. These are my friends, Ruth Peterson and Alice Martinez. We thought you might appreciate some help preparing for the wedding, especially since you don't have family here to assist you." The gesture was so unexpected, so genuinely kind, that Lydia felt tears prick her eyes. "I would appreciate that very much," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Please, come in. I just made coffee." The afternoon that followed was a revelation. The 4 women descended on the house with the kind of organized efficiency that suggested they'd done this before, dividing tasks among themselves with barely a word of discussion. Margaret took charge of planning the wedding feast, making lists of what could be prepared in advance and what would need to be cooked the day of. Ruth, who had a gift for sewing, examined Lydia's meager wardrobe and declared that with some creative alterations and additional fabric, they could create a wedding dress worthy of the occasion. Alice, whose husband owned the general store, offered to coordinate decorations and ensure adequate seating for guests. And Sarah, surprisingly, appointed herself general coordinator, managing the others with the same forceful personality that had made her such an effective antagonist. But now that energy was directed toward helping rather than hindering, and Lydia found herself grateful for Sarah's organizational skills. "You'll need flowers," Sarah announced, making notes on a small pad of paper. "The wild roses should still be blooming in the high meadow. Alice, can your boys gather them the morning of the wedding? And we'll need ribbon, lots of ribbon. Margaret, check with the general store about what colors they have in stock." "Sarah," Lydia interrupted gently, "you don't have to do all this. I know we haven't exactly been friends." Sarah set down her pencil and looked at Lydia directly. "No, we haven't, and that's entirely my fault. But I meant what I said in town. I want to make amends, And more than that, I want to help create the kind of community where women support each other instead of tearing each other down. If that starts with helping you have the wedding you deserve, then I'm honored to be part of it." There was such sincerity in her words that Lydia found herself believing it. "Thank you," she said softly, "for this and for speaking up in town. It made a difference." "You made the difference," Sarah corrected, "by being exactly who you are and refusing to apologize for it. I just finally had the sense to recognize that." The women stayed for hours, and by the time they left, Lydia had a detailed plan for the wedding, promises of help from a dozen other townswomen, and the beginnings of what felt like actual friendships. It was more than she'd dared hope for, and she found herself looking forward to becoming part of this community in a way she never had in Boston, where her friendships had always been constrained by class and circumstance. That evening, when she told Rowan about the visit, he listened with a smile that grew wider with each detail. "They really came all the way out here just to help plan the wedding, and to apologize in Sarah's case, and to welcome me into the community." Lydia shook her head in wonder. "I expected to be fighting for acceptance for months, maybe years, but somehow everything shifted." "You shifted it," Rowan said firmly, "by proving yourself, by standing your ground, by being so undeniably competent and brave that even the most stubborn gossips had to admit they were wrong about you. Or maybe they just realized that judging people based on circumstances rather than character is a fool's game," Lydia suggested. "Either way, I'm grateful." The barn reconstruction progressed with remarkable speed, aided by neighbors who showed up unannounced to help, some motivated by genuine friendship with Rowan, others perhaps seeking to make amends for their earlier judgment. Even James and Thomas Hendricks appeared one morning with a wagon full of lumber and offers of assistance, their quiet presence speaking volumes about their own regret over their sister's earlier behavior. Lydia watched from the house as the new structure took shape, and she was struck by the symbolism of it. The old barn, burned by criminals and prejudice, was being replaced by something stronger, built with help from a community that had learned to look past surface scandal to see the truth beneath. It felt like a metaphor for her own transformation, the life she'd planned destroyed, replaced by something better than she'd imagined possible. The week before the wedding brought news that the Garson gang had been captured attempting to rob a bank 2 counties over. Sheriff Cassidy rode out personally to deliver the information, looking deeply satisfied. "Your description was the key, Miss Monroe," he said, accepting the coffee Lydia offered. "When they tried to pull that bank job, the local sheriff recognized them immediately from the warrants we'd issued. There was a shootout. 2 of them were wounded, none killed, thankfully. And now they're all in custody, awaiting trial. They'll hang for the murder of a ranch hand they killed last month, and good riddance." "So it's over?" Lydia asked, hardly daring to believe it. "We're safe?" "Safe as anyone can be in frontier territory," the sheriff confirmed. "There'll always be some element of danger out here, but the immediate threat is gone. You and Mr. Blackwell can marry and build your life without looking over your shoulders." After the sheriff left, Rowan found Lydia standing in the middle of the new barn, running her hand over the smooth new wood and breathing in the scent of fresh timber and possibility. "This is beautiful," she said as he approached. "Different from the old barn, but beautiful in its own way." "Better than the old barn," Rowan corrected, coming to stand beside her. "Stronger foundation, better ventilation, more storage. Sometimes destruction makes room for improvement." Lydia heard the deeper meaning in his words. "Are we still talking about the barn?" "Maybe not entirely." Rowan's smile was soft, almost shy. "I've been thinking about what you said, about how the life you planned was destroyed, and I wonder if maybe that's not always a tragedy. Maybe sometimes we need our plans destroyed so we can build something better." "Philosophy from a rancher," Lydia teased gently. "Who would have thought?" "I contain multitudes," Rowan said with mock solemnity, then grew serious again. "I mean it, though. If Charles Porter had kept his word, you'd be stuck in a loveless marriage with a weak man, managing his store and probably being undermined by his sister-in-law at every turn. Instead, you're here, with me, building something real." "I know," Lydia said softly. "I thought the same thing myself. I was so angry when I first arrived, so hurt by the rejection, but now I'm grateful for it. Charles Porter did me a favor by showing his true colors before we were bound together. He cleared the path for something infinitely better. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, one of those perfect Colorado mornings where the sky seemed impossibly blue and the air carried just enough crispness to be refreshing without being cold. Lydia woke early in her small bedroom, the last morning she would sleep there alone, and allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection before the chaos of the day began. She thought about her mother, who would never see her married. She thought about her father, who would have loved Rowan's straightforward honesty and strong work ethic. She thought about the young woman who'd stepped off the train just over a month ago, heartbroken and humiliated, with no idea what the future held. "I made it, Mama," she whispered to the empty room. "I made it through the hard part, and I found something worth keeping. I hope you can see that, wherever you are. I hope you're proud." The knock on her door announced Margaret Chen's arrival, followed shortly by Ruth, Alice, and Sarah, all carrying baskets and boxes and chattering with excitement. They descended on Lydia like a benevolent whirlwind, helping her bathe and dress, arranging her hair in an elaborate style that was somehow both elegant and practical, pinning the veil Ruth had made from delicate lace that had belonged to her grandmother. The dress they'd created together was simple but stunning. White cotton with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs, fitted at the waist and flowing to the floor in clean lines that suited Lydia's figure. It wasn't the elaborate gown she might have worn in Boston, but it was perfect for a frontier wedding, practical enough that she could wear it again for special occasions, but special enough that she felt beautiful when she looked in the mirror. "You look like you belong here," Sarah said softly, meeting Lydia's eyes in the reflection. "Not like an Eastern lady playing at frontier life, but like a woman who's found her place. It suits you." "Thank you," Lydia said, and meant it deeply. "For everything. For this dress, for your help, for your friendship. I know it wasn't easy for you to change your opinion of me." "It was the easiest thing in the world once I stopped being stubborn and blind," Sarah replied. "You earned my respect and my friendship, Lydia, and you'll have both for as long as you want them." The ceremony was held in the new barn, transformed for the occasion with wildflowers and ribbon and rows of benches borrowed from the church. Nearly everyone from Silver Ridge had come, along with ranchers from neighboring properties and friends from as far as Denver. The crowd was larger than Lydia had expected, and she felt a flutter of nerves as Margaret led her to the entrance. "Ready?" the older woman asked gently. Lydia took a deep breath and looked through the open barn doors to where Rowan stood waiting at the makeshift altar, Marcus and Cal flanking him like the family they'd become. He was dressed in his Sunday best, a black suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, his hair actually tamed for once, his face cleanly shaved. But what struck her most was the expression on his face when he caught sight of her, wonder and joy and something that looked very much like love. "Ready," Lydia confirmed, and stepped forward into her future. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of Pastor Williams's words and her own responses, of Rowan's steady voice promising to love and honor and cherish, of the ring he slipped onto her finger, a simple gold band that had belonged to his grandmother. But the moment that stood out with crystal clarity was when the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, and Rowan cupped her face gently in his work-roughened hands and kissed her like she was the most precious thing he'd ever held. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Lydia had experienced in her carefully controlled Boston life. There was dancing to music provided by local fiddlers, food prepared by what seemed like every woman in 3 counties, laughter and toasts and heartfelt congratulations from people who'd been strangers just weeks ago but now felt like community. Children ran wild between the adults, chasing each other with shrieking laughter. Old men told stories that grew more exaggerated with each retelling. And at the center of it all, Rowan kept Lydia close, his hand at the small of her back or clasping hers, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. Sheriff Cassidy made a toast that drew cheers to Mr. and Mrs. Blackwell. "May your marriage be as strong as your barn and your love as enduring as these mountains. And may you never again have to face down outlaws in your night clothes." Even Charles Porter's absence was noted and turned into humor. Thomas Brennan, who'd closed the general store to attend, raised his glass and declared, "To Charles Porter, the biggest fool in Colorado territory who let a good woman slip away and gave a better man the chance to win her. May he spend the rest of his days regretting his cowardice." The crowd roared approval, and Lydia found herself laughing despite the impropriety of toasting the man who'd rejected her at her own wedding. But there was no malice in it, no bitterness. Charles Porter had become a punchline, a cautionary tale, while she'd become something far better. A woman who'd turned rejection into opportunity and built a life that was authentically hers. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Rowan pulled Lydia away from the celebration and led her up the hillside behind the house to a spot that overlooked the entire valley. Below them, the party continued, music and laughter drifting up on the evening breeze. Above them, the first stars were beginning to emerge. "I have something to show you," Rowan said, and there was an excitement in his voice that made Lydia curious. He led her around the hillside to where a foundation had been laid, new stone and timber marking the corners of a structure that didn't yet exist. "What is this?" Lydia asked, though part of her already knew. "Our house," Rowan said. "The ranch house down there. It served me well, but it's a bachelor's house built for function rather than family. I want to build us something new, something we design together that fits the life we want to have. Big enough for the children I hope we'll have someday, with a library for your books, and an office where we can manage the ranch business together. A real home, Lydia, built on purpose, not accident." Lydia walked the perimeter of the foundation, taking in the scope of what he was proposing. It was larger than the current house, situated to take advantage of the morning sun and the valley views. She could already imagine it. Windows flooding rooms with light, a porch where they could sit and watch the seasons change, children's laughter echoing through halls that didn't yet exist. "When did you plan this?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "I started thinking about it the day you shot at those men," Rowan admitted. "Watching you defend something that wasn't even yours yet with such fierce determination, I knew then that I wanted you to have a home worth defending, a place that was truly ours, built from the ground up with intention and care." Lydia turned to face him. This man who'd offered her dignity when she had nothing, who'd defended her against public opinion, who'd proposed marriage on a dusty road, and was now promising to build her a house on a hillside. "I don't need a grand house to be happy, Rowan. I just need you." "I know," he said, pulling her close. "But you deserve both. You deserve everything I can give you, Lydia. A home, a partnership, a life built on love instead of convenience. Let me give you that. Let me spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the gift you've given me just by choosing to stay." They stood there in the gathering darkness, wrapped in each other's arms, and Lydia felt a peace settle over her that she'd never experienced before. This was where she belonged. Not because circumstances had forced her here, not because she'd had no other options, but because she'd chosen it. She'd chosen Rowan, chosen this ranch, chosen this community, and they'd chosen her in return. The years that followed proved the foundation they'd built together was as strong as the one Rowan laid for their new house. They moved into the completed home 18 months after their wedding, a celebration in itself that drew the same community that had attended their marriage. By then, Lydia was 6 months pregnant with their first child, and she supervised the furniture arrangement from a rocking chair Rowan had insisted she use, her hands resting on the swell of her belly where their daughter kicked and tumbled. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Lydia's gift for organization and numbers complemented Rowan's practical knowledge of cattle and land, and together they expanded the operation, adding new pastures and diversifying into horse breeding. Marcus and Cal became more family than employees, with Marcus eventually marrying a widow from town and Cal taking over as head foreman when age finally slowed the older man down. Sarah Hendricks became one of Lydia's closest friends, the two women discovering they had more in common than either had initially realized. Sarah eventually married a surveyor who came through town and fell in love with both her and the land, and their children grew up playing with Lydia and Rowan's growing brood. The town of Silver Ridge grew as well, evolving from a rough frontier settlement into a proper community with a school, a library that Lydia helped establish, and a reputation for welcoming newcomers rather than judging them. Lydia became known not as the mail-order bride who'd been rejected, but as the woman who'd faced down the Garson gang and helped build one of the most successful ranches in 3 counties. She taught Sunday school, served on the town council, and eventually wrote a series of articles about frontier life that were published in Eastern newspapers, giving her a modest fame she'd never sought but used to advocate for women's education and opportunities. But perhaps the sweetest vindication came 5 years after Lydia's arrival, when Charles Porter returned to Silver Ridge with his wife. his late wife's sister, who turned out to be exactly as managing and difficult as Rowan had predicted. They attended church one Sunday, sitting stiffly in a back pew while Porter avoided everyone's eyes. Lydia, sitting with Rowan and their two children in their usual spot near the front, caught sight of them and felt nothing but pity. After the service, she approached them with genuine kindness. "Mr. Porter, Mrs. Porter, welcome back to Silver Ridge. I hope you're both well." Charles couldn't meet her eyes, but he mumbled something that might have been a greeting. His wife, however, looked Lydia up and down with barely concealed bitterness, taking in her fine dress, her healthy children, the way Rowan stood protectively at her side, the respect with which other churchgoers greeted her. "I see you've done quite well for yourself," the woman said, her voice tight. "I've been very fortunate," Lydia agreed, choosing to interpret the comment charitably. "This community has been welcoming and generous. I hope you'll find it equally so." She meant it sincerely, but she also knew the truth. Charles Porter would never find in Silver Ridge what she'd found, because he'd never learned the fundamental lesson that had saved her. That sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you is actually the best thing, if you're brave enough to see the opportunity hidden in the disaster. That being rejected can be the first step toward being chosen by someone better. That the future you think you want is sometimes just a pale shadow of the future you deserve. 10 years after Lydia stepped off that train expecting one future and finding another, she stood on the porch of the house Rowan had built for her and watched the sunset over the valley that had become her home. Her oldest daughter was inside practicing piano, the music drifting through the open windows. Her son was in the barn with Rowan, learning to care for the new foals. Her youngest was asleep on her hip, tiny fingers clutching her collar. Margaret Chen had been right all those years ago on the train. Lydia had never met Charles Porter before agreeing to marry him. But she'd met Rowan in an alley at her lowest moment, and from that meeting had grown something more valuable than any carefully planned arrangement could have produced. She'd found not just a husband, but a partner. Not just a home, but a purpose. Not just survival, but a life worth living. "Mama, look," her daughter called from inside. "I can play the whole song without stopping now." Lydia smiled, kissed the soft head of her sleeping baby, and went inside to where music and laughter and the comfortable chaos of family life waited. She'd come to Colorado as a mail-order bride, unwanted and discarded. But she'd become something far greater, a woman who'd built her own future from the ashes of someone else's broken promises. A wife and mother and rancher who'd earned every bit of respect and happiness she'd found. And as she listened to her daughter play and felt her baby's warm weight in her arms and heard Rowan's voice drifting from the barn, teaching their son with the same patient kindness he'd shown her on that first desperate day, Lydia Monroe Blackwell knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. She'd been loved before she ever arrived, by a man who'd seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself. And that love had transformed everything, turning rejection into redemption, and making her not into the bride someone else wanted, but into the woman she was always meant to become. The cowboy who loved her before she ever arrived had given her more than a home on a Colorado hillside. He'd given her back herself. And that, Lydia thought as she joined her daughter at the piano and added her voice to the music filling their home, was the greatest gift she'd ever received. The end.